Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Beyond the silence of night lie stories too strange to ignore, and tonight we open one of them. The road at night can feel like a dream, a ribbon of asphalt winding through silence, the headlights casting pale arcs into the darkness, the hum of tires repeating like a mantra. Beyond the glow of the car, the world recedes into shadow. Trees become silhouettes, hills dissolve into black shapes, and above it all the stars shimmer in their endless rhythm, as if reminding us of how small, how fleeting our journeys really are. It was on such a road, more than 60 years ago, that Betty and Barney Hill made their way home. It was September 19th, 1961. The white mountains of New Hampshire stretched in quiet majesty around them. The hour was late, and the little towns they passed through had long since gone to sleep. Storefronts were dark, diners shuttered, only the occasional porch light still burning. The world seemed suspended, hushed, waiting. Betty and Barney were an ordinary couple returning from an ordinary trip. They had spent their vacation in Montreal, pausing at Niagara Falls on the way back. They were both dedicated to their work, Barney at the post office in Portsmouth, Betty as a social worker. They cared deeply about their community and about each other. In 1961, as an interracial couple, their marriage carried its own quiet strength. They moved through life with a blend of love, resilience, and discretion. This night, their only thought was getting home to New Hampshire before dawn. But somewhere along Route 3, beneath a canopy of autumn stars, something entered their journey that neither could forget. Betty was the first to notice it, a light brighter than the stars, moving strangely in the sky. At first she thought little of it. Airplanes passed overhead often enough. Satellites had begun to thread the night with their silent arcs. But this light did not behave like either. It shifted, hovered, and seemed to follow them as they wound through the dark roads of the mountains. Barney, practical and cautious, was slower to acknowledge it. He assured her it was nothing unusual, perhaps a plane, perhaps a trick of perspective. Yet as the miles passed, the light remained, dancing in ways no aircraft should. Betty grew certain it was something extraordinary. Barney, though unconvinced, began to feel the unease pressing in. This was the beginning of what would become the first widely known case of alien abduction in the United States. The Hills' experience would ripple far beyond the New England highways, beyond the quiet of their own lives, into books, films, and decades of cultural imagination. But on that night, it was simply two people on a lonely road, facing a mystery they could neither dismiss nor fully grasp. The hours that followed would leave them with missing time, moments erased, replaced by silence. They would return home with torn clothing, scuffed shoes, and memories that did not align. Betty would dream of strange beings, of examinations aboard a craft. Barney would struggle with anxiety and images he tried to push away. And under hypnosis, guided by a calm psychiatrist, their stories would emerge with uncanny detail, weaving together a narrative that continues to stir wonder and debate. As we step into their journey tonight, let us do so gently. This is not a tale of fear, nor of certainty. It is a story whispered across time, pieced together from testimony, dream, and reflection. Whether you believe in extraterrestrials or not, the Hills' account holds something deeper, a meditation on memory, on the vastness of the sky, and on the fragile boundary between waking life and the dreamlike state known as highway hypnosis. So settle in. Allow the rhythm of this story to become the rhythm of your own breathing. The road is before us, stretching endlessly into night. The stars are bright, the air is cool, and the hum of the tires is steady. Whatever lies ahead, we will take it slowly, step by step, like the Hills on their way home. Let the mystery carry you, not to startle, but to soothe. Let the questions linger like the faint echo of crickets in the distance. And as we drift deeper into their story, remember, the silence of the night holds many things. Sometimes it holds answers, and sometimes it holds only the space where questions may rest. Welcome to the journey of Betty and Barney Hill. Welcome to the long, quiet road of September 1961. Welcome to the beginning of the mystery. Chapter 1. The Journey Home. The story begins not with strangeness but with ordinary life. Betty and Barney Hill were, in many ways, like countless other couples in early 1960s America. They lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a small city near the Atlantic coast. Their days were filled with work, errands, and community service. Barney worked long hours at the post office, commuting each day in his neatly pressed uniform, the rhythm of letters and parcels shaping his weeks. Betty served as a social worker, visiting homes, listening to families, guiding children through difficult times. Together they carried more than just the weight of their jobs. As an interracial couple in 1961, they lived in a world where their marriage was still unusual, sometimes even controversial. Yet they moved with quiet confidence, sustained by one another's company. Their friends described them as warm, intelligent, and principled. Their evenings were filled with conversation, books, and the companionship of their beloved dachshund, Delcy. That September, they decided to take a vacation. The plan was simple: drive north into Canada, visit Montreal and Niagara Falls, and then return home through the back roads of New England. It was a trip of relaxation, a pause from responsibilities. Photographs from that time show them smiling, Betty in modest dresses, Barney in his familiar jacket and tie. They were travelers not chasing adventure, but savoring the quiet moments that long drives bring. On the evening of September 19th, they set their course back toward New Hampshire. The decision was practical. They could have stayed another night, but Barney had work the next morning, and both felt the pull of home. The drive was long, but familiar. Route 3 cut through the White Mountains, winding past forests that were beginning to turn with the early touch of autumn. The night was clear, the stars sharp against the darkness. It was late when they entered the quieter stretches of highway. The small towns gave way to open spaces, to winding curves where the road seemed to belong entirely to them. The Chevrolet Bel Air, their sturdy car, purred steadily along. Inside, the headlights cast a tunnel of light, illuminating signs, guardrails, and the occasional reflective eyes of a deer paused at the roadside. The hours of night driving carried a kind of trance. Psychologists call it highway hypnosis, the strange drifting state where the mind moves between alertness and daydream, where miles can pass unnoticed. For many drivers, it is a familiar companion. For the Hills, it was the texture of this journey home, the rhythm of their return. Betty sat beside Barney, watching the sky as much as the road. She had always been drawn to the stars. Perhaps it was her curiosity, her sense that the world held more than what was easily explained. Barney was more grounded, practical, a man of routines. He trusted what he could measure, what he could see directly. Together they balanced one another. Betty's openness, Barney's caution. As the car climbed the gentle grades of the mountains, Betty noticed something unusual. At first it was only a light, brighter than the stars, hanging low in the sky. She leaned forward, peering through the windshield. It seemed too steady to be a star, too bright to be a distant planet. For a moment, she considered whether it could be an airplane. But as the car moved, so did the light. "Barney," she said softly, not with alarm, but with curiosity. "Do you see that?" He glanced upward briefly, then back to the road. "Probably a plane," he murmured, his voice calm, steady. He had little interest in distractions. The road required attention. The curves demanded his focus. Yet Betty kept watching. The light did not behave as a plane should. It moved with a peculiar rhythm, sometimes darting slightly, sometimes pausing in place. At times it seemed closer, then further, though no sound accompanied it. Betty felt a quiet unease stir within her. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a pair of binoculars they carried for bird watching. Raising them to her eyes, she tried to focus on the light. Through the lenses, the glow sharpened. It was not just a point of brightness, it seemed structured with a shape behind it. She described it to Barney, but he shook his head, smiling faintly, dismissing it as imagination or trick of vision. "You've been reading too many of those science books," he teased gently, though there was a trace of uncertainty in his tone. The miles slipped by, the car rolled through Franconia Notch, the dark outlines of mountains rising on either side. The stars above were steady, but the light, this single insistent presence, remained. Betty's curiosity grew, while Barney's unease deepened. To distract himself, he tuned the radio, but the stations faded in and out, static overwhelming the melodies. The sound only heightened the strangeness of the moment, as if the air itself carried a hidden disturbance. Still they pressed on. The road stretched ahead, dark and quiet. The air through the window was cool, scented faintly with pine and damp earth. Their dog shifted softly in the back seat, restless but silent. In that ordinary moment, just a car on a lonely highway, two people returning home, something extraordinary was unfolding. And though neither of them knew it yet, the journey was about to take them far from the safe boundaries of routine. The light lingered. Betty lowered the binoculars, her eyes adjusting again to the naked sky. She tried to measure its movement against the familiar stars. One moment it seemed to hover near the tree line, the next it glided farther off, only to return again. There was no sound of an engine, no blinking red or green navigation lights, just a steady white glow, purposeful in its motion. Barney kept his gaze on the winding asphalt, but his knuckles tightened around the wheel. His earlier dismissal that it was simply a plane felt thinner with each mile. He wanted to believe it, wanted to keep the night ordinary. Yet the unease in Betty's voice and the persistence of the light pressed against his practical nature. "Maybe it's a satellite," he offered, trying again for explanation. "They've been sending them up all the time now." Betty shook her head. "Satellites don't zigzag, Barney. They don't stop and start." Her words fell into the cabin of the car, soft but steady. The hum of the tires filled the silence that followed. They drove on through Lincoln, a small town whose few streetlights flickered past in seconds. Then, beyond the last storefronts, the darkness returned. Above, the light still followed, as though matching their pace. Barney glanced into the rearview mirror. He expected to see nothing, just the long stretch of empty road behind them. But there it was again, framed by the mirror, as if it belonged to the car's path as much as the headlights did. He exhaled, a short, controlled breath. He did not want to alarm Betty, nor himself. Yet something about the persistence of the object unsettled him. Betty raised the binoculars once more, this time leaning slightly out of the open window to steady her view. The cool night air pressed against her cheeks. She traced the glow across the sky, her heart steady but alert. Through the glass, she caught glimpses of shape, an outline broader than a star, more definite than a mere point of light. "It looks structured," she whispered. "Not just light, something solid." Barney did not answer. He pressed the accelerator slightly, letting the Chevrolet roll faster down the quiet highway. The white lines blurred beneath them, mile after mile, yet the light matched their speed, never fading, never falling away. At a turnout near a scenic overlook, Barney slowed the car and pulled to the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. He turned off the engine, and for a moment, the world became very still. Only the chirring of late summer crickets filled the silence. Betty handed him the binoculars. "See for yourself." Barney lifted them to his eyes. At first he saw only the scatter of stars. Then slowly the object came into focus. It was not distant like the planets, nor fixed like the constellations. It moved deliberately, a disc-like form, with a faint glow radiating from its edges. He thought he saw rows of windows, tiny openings around its circumference. The sight sent a wave of disbelief through him. His rational mind scrambled for comparisons. An aircraft, a blimp, perhaps some military experiment. Yet the altitude was wrong, the movement impossible. He lowered the binoculars quickly, shaking his head as though to dismiss what he had seen. "It must be an aircraft," he insisted, his voice firmer than his conviction. "Something from the base. They test things all the time." But even as he said it, the silence of the night contradicted him. No engine, no roar, no whir of propellers, only the stillness of the mountain air. Betty studied his expression. She saw the tension in his jaw, the careful control in his words. He was trying to hold on to the ordinary, to keep the night from slipping into the unknown. They stood by the roadside for several minutes, watching the object drift and hover, its movements almost playful, almost taunting. Then, as if sensing their gaze, it began to descend, closer, lower, edging toward them, with deliberate pace. Betty touched Barney's arm. "It's coming down." He nodded, his breath tightening. Without another word, he started the car, the engine breaking the silence. They pulled back onto the highway, the headlights cutting through the dark, but the light above remained, following, adjusting its course to theirs. Mile after mile, the pursuit continued. The hills spoke little, their silence heavier than conversation. Each turn of the road, each rise and fall of the hills, seemed mirrored in the object's movements. At times, it darted ahead, then slowed, waiting for them. At other times, it drifted beside them, as though pacing the Chevrolet. The rhythm of highway hypnosis, those lulling miles of repetition, was broken now by a tension that settled over both of them. Barney tried to focus on the practical. He noted landmarks, checked the dashboard clock, calculated distances. Betty, binoculars in hand, whispered observations, the tilt of the object, the way its glow shifted, the peculiar steadiness of its course, and all the while, the road stretched on, carrying them deeper into the night, deeper into something they could not explain. The air inside the car grew cooler as the windows fogged faintly with their breath. Betty lowered the glass to let in the fresh mountain air. The smell of pine and damp earth drifted through. It grounded them, a reminder of the world they knew, even as something unknown hovered just beyond reach. The dog in the back seat stirred again, restless, as if sensing the change. Betty reached back to soothe her, murmuring softly, though her eyes never left the sky. The journey home, once simple and unremarkable, had become a passage into uncertainty, and though they did not yet know it, these moments, the steady pursuit of the light, the uneasy silence between them, would mark the beginning of a mystery that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The miles slipped away under the Chevrolet's tires, yet the presence in the sky remained. The longer it followed, the less it felt like chance. Barney stole glances upward, then back to the road, his focus split. He prided himself on being practical, grounded in the everyday. A postal worker, a veteran, he trusted systems, routines, facts. But tonight, facts seemed harder to hold on to. Betty, binoculars pressed to her eyes, continued her watch. "It's closer now," she said quietly. "I can see more shape." "What shape?" Barney asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. She hesitated, searching for words. "Like a disc, tilted slightly." I think there are windows along the edge." Barney tightened his grip on the wheel. The word windows lodged in his thoughts. Windows belonged to aircraft, to buildings, to things made by human hands. The suggestion unsettled him. They rounded another bend in the highway. The forest pressed in close on either side, the trees tall and dark, their tops dissolving into the night sky. Ahead, the road opened into a stretch of meadow, wide enough to give them a clear view of the heavens. And there it was, no longer a distant light, but a structured craft, gliding silently across the open sky. Betty drew in a sharp breath. Even without the binoculars, its form was visible now. A broad, metallic disc, its surface reflecting faint starlight, its motion smooth, deliberate, and strangely elegant. It drifted across the meadow, then slowed, as if waiting. "Barney," she whispered, "you see it, don't you?" He did. There was no denying it now. The object was real, tangible, not a trick of imagination or lens. He pulled the car to the side of the road again, this time more abruptly. Gravel popped beneath the tires as they came to a stop. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a night breeze. Then Barney reached for the binoculars. His movements were deliberate, steady, as though control could keep fear at bay. He stepped out of the car, the door creaking in the silence, and raised the binoculars toward the craft. What he saw through the lenses drained the last of his skepticism. The disc hovered low, no more than a few 100 feet above the ground. Around its rim were distinct rows of windows, lit faintly from within, and behind those windows, shapes moved, figures, small and thin, peering out into the night. Barney's pulse quickened. He felt exposed, standing in the open, gazing at something that gazed back. His mind reached for explanations. Pilots, test aircraft, a trick of light, but none fit. The figures moved with intention, as though aware of him. He lowered the binoculars quickly, breath shallow. A rush of fear pressed against his ribs. "Dakin switting siziad. They're watching us," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He turned back toward the car, urgency in his stride. Betty leaned out the window, alarm flickering in her face. "What did you see?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened the driver's door, slid into his seat, and started the engine with trembling hands. "We have to get out of here," he said. "They're going to capture us." Betty stared at him, startled by the certainty in his tone. This was not the calm, practical Barney she knew. This was a man gripped by fear he could not explain. The Chevrolet lurched forward, gravel spitting beneath its tires. Back on the highway, the car gained speed, the headlights sweeping across the dark curves. But even as they raced onward, the craft remained, keeping pace above the tree line. Inside the car, silence thickened. Betty held the binoculars in her lap, her fingers tight around them, but she did not raise them again. The look on Barney's face had told her enough. The road wound deeper into the white mountains. Shadows of trees flickered past in the beams of the headlights. Occasionally, the object would dart ahead, then slow, as if guiding them along. Barney's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles pale. He drove faster than usual, though the twisting road demanded care. His thoughts were a blur, snatches of military service, of discipline, of duty, colliding with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. At one point, the craft dipped lower, sweeping across the road ahead. Barney slammed the brakes, and the car shuddered to a halt. The disc hovered silently, filling the windshield with its presence. Rows of windows glowed faintly. Figures shifted inside. For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Then the craft tilted, rose slightly, and glided away once more, disappearing briefly behind the trees. Betty and Barney sat frozen, their breaths ragged in the stillness of the car. The night pressed close around them. "Barney," Betty whispered, her voice thin. "What are they?" He shook his head, unable to answer. His hands trembled as he reached for the gear shift. "We have to keep moving," he said. "We can't stop." The Chevrolet rolled forward again, but the sense of pursuit only deepened. The road stretched ahead, mile after mile, carrying them towards something unknown. Neither of them could have guessed how the next hours would unfold, how silence would swallow memory, how fragments would later return in dreams and hypnosis. For now, all they could do was drive, guided by headlights, shadowed by something from beyond the ordinary sky. The journey home had become a passage into mystery, one from which they would never fully return. The road wound ever downward, leading them out of the mountains and into quieter valleys. The Chevrolet's headlights cut across the curves, pale cones sweeping the dark. Yet, no matter how far they drove, the presence above remained. Betty stole glances through the windshield, sometimes raising the binoculars again, though each look only confirmed what she already knew. The craft was following, It moved with intent, neither aimless nor random. It seemed to choose its place in the sky, adjusting whenever the car changed speed or direction. Barney said little. His jaw was tight, his focus narrowed to the road ahead. He felt the weight of responsibility, protecting Betty, keeping the car steady, holding together the fragments of control he still possessed. Inside him, disbelief battled fear. He had faced danger before, but never like this, never from something that defied the laws of motion themselves. Then, quite suddenly, the encounter shifted. The object dipped lower once more, sweeping across the highway, and then descended into a nearby field. Barney slowed, pulling the car to the side, unable to resist the need to understand. Gravel crunched, the engine idled, and silence pressed in. "Stay here," he said quietly to Betty, though his voice carried more urgency than authority. He reached for the binoculars, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the open field. The night air was cool and sharp. Each step carried him closer to the unknown. Above the meadow, the disc hovered silently, no sound, no trail, no exhaust. Its surface gleamed faintly in starlight, smooth and seamless. Around its rim, the windows glowed. Barney lifted the binoculars to his eyes. Through the lenses, the details sharpened. Behind those windows he saw them, figures, small and thin, their heads larger than human proportion, their eyes dark and deep even at this distance. They moved deliberately, not in chaos, but in unison, as though aware of being observed. A wave of dread surged through him. These were not pilots, not soldiers, not anything he could explain. The figures shifted, turned toward him. In that instant, he felt more than watched. He felt targeted. Terror broke through his composure. The thought struck him like lightning. "They're going to capture us." He lowered the binoculars, heart racing, and stumbled backward. His legs carried him in a rush toward the car. Gravel slipped under his shoes as he reached the Chevrolet, yanked the door open, and collapsed into the driver's seat. "Drive," Betty urged, sensing his fear without needing words. The car lurched forward, engine straining, as Barney pressed hard on the accelerator. The craft rose from the meadow, gliding after them once more. For a while, it felt like a chase. The disc dipped and darted, sometimes above the tree line, sometimes closer, sometimes vanishing entirely, before reappearing just ahead. The road narrowed into curves again, the headlights bouncing across guardrails and branches. Then, without warning, a new sound entered the night. From the trunk of the car came a series of rhythmic beeps, mechanical, sharp, alien in tone. Both Betty and Barney froze at the sound. The beeping pulsed steadily, like a coded signal, filling the cabin with its strange insistence. Barney's grip on the wheel tightened. He pressed harder on the gas, but the car seemed suddenly sluggish. Its response dulled, as though caught in a current, not its own. The beeping grew louder, then softer, then louder again, echoing through the frame of the car. Betty clutched her hands in her lap, eyes wide. "What is that?" she whispered, though neither expected an answer. Their last clear memory of the road ended there. The next thing they recalled was different. They were still driving, but the night had shifted. The stars seemed lower, the road unfamiliar, the distance from their last landmark greater than it should have been. The air inside the car felt heavy, charged. The beeping had stopped, replaced once more by silence. Both sat in dazed quiet. Time seemed broken, its rhythm stolen. At last, familiar signs began to appear. The edges of towns, the glow of occasional streetlights. The car rolled steadily on, but both sensed something was missing. The journey had gaps, stretches of absence neither could account for. When at last they reached Portsmouth, the first edge of dawn was creeping over the horizon. Their home waited, unchanged, ordinary. They pulled into the driveway, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. The dog whimpered softly from the back seat. Betty reached to soothe her, though her own hands trembled. Inside the house, routine tried to reassert itself. Coats were hung, lights switched on, the kettle filled for tea. Yet the night pressed against them still. Betty noticed her dress was torn at the hem, a rip she could not explain. Barney's shoes were scuffed, though he could not recall stumbling. Their watches, usually precise, had both stopped, frozen at the same inexplicable time. On the driveway, the car itself bore strange marks, circular patches of shine on the trunk where the paint seemed altered. Betty fetched a small compass from the house, curious. When she held it near those patches, the needle spun wildly. Elsewhere on the car, it remained steady. They exchanged glances. Words felt thin against the weight of what had happened. The silence between them carried both fear and awe, both confusion and unspoken questions. Barney tried to steady himself. We'll sort it out later," he said quietly, but his voice trembled. Betty nodded, though her eyes were far away, still searching the night sky, even as morning light broke. The journey home had ended, yet the true journey, the one into memory, mystery, and the uncharted spaces of human experience, had only just begun. Chapter 2: The Encounter. Morning light did little to ease the unease of the night before. The Hills awoke in their Portsmouth home, surrounded by the familiar walls lined with books, a kitchen that smelled of coffee, the small sounds of neighborhood life beginning outside. Yet beneath the surface of routine, both carried a heaviness. Sleep had not come easily. When it did, it was fractured, restless, filled with fragments of images they could not name. Betty moved slowly through the kitchen, her hands steady on the kettle, but her mind elsewhere. She found herself replaying the drive again and again, the light that followed, the sudden beeping, the strange sense of lost hours. Her dress hung over a chair, the tear in its hem catching her eye. She had no memory of it ripping. Barney sat at the table, his newspaper folded but unread. His shoes, scuffed from the night before, rested by the door. He was a man who prided himself on order, polished shoes, pressed uniforms, punctuality. Yet now, small disruptions spoke louder than headlines. The watches that had stopped, the compass needle that had spun uncontrollably near the trunk of the car, the silence of the road after the beeping, all of it pressed against his sense of reason. Neither spoke openly of aliens. Neither wanted to give shape to such an idea. Instead, they circled the memory, describing details without naming conclusions. "Those sounds," Betty said softly. "Do you remember how they pulsed almost like a pattern?" Barney nodded, but did not lift his eyes. "Yes, but I don't understand why the car felt different, why it was harder to control." Silence followed. They let their questions hang, unanswered, suspended between them like mist. In the days that followed, Betty could not let go of the mystery. She visited the library, pulling books on astronomy, psychology, even folklore from the shelves. At the time, there was little written about UFOs beyond scattered reports and sensational headlines. But what she found only sharpened her curiosity. Barney, in contrast, tried to bury the night. He worked his shifts, kept his routines, and avoided conversation about it. Yet his body betrayed him. He grew tense, restless, waking from uneasy sleep with his heart racing. He avoided driving near the site where they had stopped, as though the road itself might remember. It was Betty who, in her search for answers, reached out to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, known as NICAP. This civilian group collected reports of UFOs and sought to investigate them seriously, without ridicule. In letters, Betty described what she and Barney had experienced. She did not dramatize. She set down the facts as best she could, the times, the locations, the observations. Her correspondence brought visits from investigators. They listened carefully, asked precise questions, and took notes. For the first time, the Hills felt their story was being treated with seriousness, though the weight of the mystery did not lessen. Then the dreams began. 2 weeks after the encounter, Betty woke in the early hours of morning, trembling. She had dreamed of figures, small, pale beings who led her from the car into a craft. The dreams returned night after night, vivid, repeating with uncanny consistency. She remembered corridors, examination rooms, instruments she could not name. She recalled a being who showed her a star map, lines connecting bright points like a teacher explaining a lesson. She told Barney, her voice low, hesitant. He listened, but the unease in his expression deepened. He did not want to believe, yet he could not dismiss the conviction in her voice. Still, he did not share his own secret. Barney had no dreams, but he carried flashes of images he tried to suppress, figures glimpsed through windows, a sensation of paralysis, the echo of dread when he whispered, "They're going to capture us." His silence grew heavier, his health faltered. Anxiety and exhaustion weighed on him until Betty urged him to seek help. What neither of them could have known was that their path was leading toward a deeper unveiling. The strange journey on Route 3 had not ended at their doorstep. It had only begun, and in time, under the guidance of a calm psychiatrist, the hours they could not remember would begin to surface, piece by piece, in voices that trembled but did not break. The dreams arrived like tides, soft at first, then insistent. 2 weeks after the night on Route 3, Betty began waking before dawn with fragments clinging to her like mist. She would sit at the edge of the bed, listening to the hush of the house, trying to gather what the night had given. The images were precise in detail, yet blurred at the edges, like memories seen through glass. At first, she spoke of them tentatively, wary of assigning them meaning. But the dreams returned, each one echoing the last with small variations, as if the story wished to be heard in full. She told Barney that in the dream there was a road, a turn, and the soft chime of beeps that did not belong to any engine she knew. Then figures by the headlights, short and slender, with movements so smooth they seemed to glide. She and Barney were not dragged, not forced, not in the manner of nightmares, but led as if through a corridor of night air that opened where no door had been. Their car remained behind on the shoulder, quiet and waiting, the dog curled into herself like a small, trusting moon. In the dreams, the air inside the craft was cool and without smell. Light seemed to come from everywhere at once, no lamp, no bulb, only a pale, even glow. Betty remembered the sound of her own breathing, the slow, calming rhythm of it, and the way a hand, small, careful, rested lightly at her elbow, as though to steady her. There were others nearby, precise in their movements, attending to their tasks with the serenity of a practiced ritual. It did not feel cruel, it did not feel kind. It felt clinical, like the quiet of a medical office after closing, when only instruments and intention remain. Barney listened with his hands folded, his gaze lowered to the table, the pattern in the wood suddenly compelling. He nodded in the right places and said little. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. It wasn't disbelief that silenced him so much as a pressure behind the ribs, a sense that if he acknowledged too much, something fragile inside him might fracture. At night he slept, but fitfully. The slightest noise at the window would bring him awake with a rush of heat, like stepping from shadow into floodlight. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. Betty's recollections grew more detailed. She described a room, oval, perhaps circular, its edges softened by the even light. A chair, not quite like a chair, with rounded supports that rose under her arms and at the base of her neck. A device passed gently over her skin, as though reading something beneath its surface. She spoke of calm voices, not heard but understood, phrases sensed rather than spoken. "You will not be harmed. This will be brief. We are learning. We are comparing." Each sentence tasted like reassurance, even as it revealed nothing. In her telling there was no pain, only a disquiet that seated itself in the body and would not leave. There was a moment with a book, not a book, but something that mimicked the shape of one, thin plates stacked and hinged, images on their surfaces that shifted with her gaze. stars arranged in a pattern she did not recognize, lines connecting them like roads on a map, a web of routes drawn across dark distance. A finger indicated a point, then traced a path, then rested on another star. She remembered the odd certainty that the path was not a story told to her, but a route shown, like directions to a town known to the speaker and unknown to the listener. In the morning she drew the map as best she could, dots and lines floating on white paper. She did not claim to know what it meant. She only wanted to capture the geometry before it thinned. She traced the path again, eyes half closed, as if following a remembered voyage, from one brightness to another, across a quiet sea. Barney watched her draw, and felt both love and distance, as if her pencil were building a bridge he could not yet cross. He could not meet the map with belief. He could not meet it with denial. Instead, he busied his hands, polishing his shoes, aligning the mailbag he carried to work, adjusting a tie that needed no adjustment. Order was a comfort. Routine was a language he spoke without thinking. He needed their weight in his day to balance whatever drifted toward him from the edges of memory. He did carry his own flashes. They arrived without warning and departed without peace. A row of windows, not large yet inescapable, figures framed by them still as portraits until they moved together with precise grace. A feeling not of running but of being held in place by attention alone, as if the air had hardened gently around him. A phrase that had leapt from his throat on the roadside. "They're going to capture us," and the bewilderment that his mouth had chosen those words before his mind agreed to them. When the images rose, he would steady himself with familiar anchors, the post office clock striking the hour, the clean snap of a letter sorted into the proper rack, the sound of his name called across a room. Nights Betty wrote in her journal with a soft pencil, careful not to wake him. She practiced a slow, even breathing she had read about, counting the exhale, following it to stillness, letting the images come and then pass, like clouds with their own destinations. She recorded only what returned without force. She circled nothing in certainty. "It may be nothing," she wrote once. "It may be memory," and then a smaller line beneath. The silence lingered. During the day, a letter from a researcher would arrive, a polite inquiry, a promise of discretion, and she would answer with measured phrases, placing facts next to feelings, keeping them distinct. She did not want to make a claim. She wanted to set a table where the details could sit without argument. Barney tried to close the door on it all, but the body keeps its own records. He began to experience an ache that moved across his shoulders like weather. His jaw tightened in his sleep. He woke once with the strange sensation that his eyes had been open for a long time in a dark room and had finally found light. He described none of this. He simply became quieter, and the quiet became his answer to questions not yet asked. On a Sunday afternoon, they drove a familiar loop along the coast in an attempt at normalcy. The ocean was a long gray sheet under a sky of the same color, and gulls drifted like pale scraps of paper in the wind. Betty folded her hands and looked straight ahead. Barney drove at the speed of calm. Neither of them mentioned the mountains. Neither mentioned the field. The road unfurled, simple and obedient, and for a while the breath in the car synchronized, the small mercy of rhythm shared. But night always returns, and with it the borderland between waking and sleep where thoughts loosen and drift. The dreams came again, the corridor of light. The room shaped like a softened circle, a soft pressure at the base of the skull, not pain but a query. A gentle hum, no source to be seen, the sense of being read, like a page passing under a quiet lamp. In one dream, Barney stood beside Betty, and their hands found each other without looking. The figures around them continued their work with serene exactness, and one turned slightly, as if to acknowledge the gesture, and then returned to the task. It felt like permission without promise, a moment held but not claimed. Morning followed with the delicate fatigue that dreams leave behind. Betty made tea. Barney folded the newspaper without opening it. The house felt both shelter and echo. They moved with the care of people who have heard a sound and are listening for it again. when a suggestion surfaced gently from a friend who knew the weight of unspoken things, that they consider speaking with a specialist in memory and stress, they did not refuse. It was not a surrender to belief, nor an invitation to certainty. It was a request for calm in a landscape of questions, a physician's office, a quiet room, the promise that nothing would be forced, that memory would be treated as a guest that comes when ready and leaves when it must. Outside, autumn deepened. Leaves edged toward copper, the air gathered its coolness, and the days shortened in a way that felt natural and reassuring. Inside, they waited, together for an appointment that might place a hand, light and careful, on the hinge of their unremembered hours and see whether it would turn. The sky remained wide, the silence lingered, the road when they drove it was ordinary again, and yet beneath that ordinariness, a current moved, steady and unseen, guiding them toward a door that had not existed until the night it opened. The suggestion came softly, the way careful advice is offered when the room is quiet. A friend who knew their steadiness, who trusted their judgment, mentioned a physician in Boston, not a sensationalist, not a seeker of headlines. A psychiatrist whose practice focused on stress and memory, on the slow repair of the nervous system after it has been asked to carry more than it should. The name settled between them, like a note that continued to hum after the sound was gone. They waited a day before making the call. Betty dialed. Barney listened from the doorway, arms folded, jaw set, as though bracing against a wind. The receptionist's voice was gentle, professional. There was an opening in 2 weeks. The appointment would be a consultation, no promises, no procedures, only a conversation in a quiet room. They accepted without looking at each other, the way people agree to something they already know is necessary. The days that followed were ordinary at the surface. Work schedules, errands, the small, reliable rituals of a shared life, but beneath the routine a river moved, steady and unseen. Betty kept writing in her journal, capturing fragments with a pencil that left soft gray lines. She did not assign labels. She did not argue with herself on the page. She wrote what returned without effort, then stopped when it thinned. The silence lingered. Barney tightened his routines, the way a sailor tightens lines before weather. He pressed his shirts carefully. He checked door locks twice without remarking on it. He drove routes he knew by heart, avoiding mountain roads that looked like the memory of another night. Sometimes he would pause with his key in the front door and gaze a few seconds at nothing in particular, as if waiting for a feeling to pass. The sky was not empty. On the morning of the appointment, the air carried the first cool certainty of autumn. They took an early train, easier than parking, quieter than the highway. The car swayed with that gentle, almost maritime motion trains have, and outside the windows towns slid past, brick facades, laundry lines, the square of a playground, all of it ordinary and soothing to look at. They spoke little. Hands rested near each other on the seat, not quite touching, the space between them alive with the comfort of company. The office was on a quiet street, set back from the main thoroughfare, a brass plate beside the door. A stairwell that smelled faintly of old varnish and paper. The waiting room held a clock that did not tick, a rug whose pattern seemed designed to give the eye a way to rest. A receptionist looked up with that calm kindness people learn in places where nerves arrive daily. "Please, make yourselves comfortable." When the doctor entered, he did so without haste. He greeted them by their first names and asked which of them would prefer to speak first. His voice was level and low, a current you could float on without needing to swim. He explained what this first meeting would be, a map-making of sorts, marking landmarks without deciding what they meant. He spoke of stress and the body, of how vigilance can linger after a startling experience, how sleep can become a threshold that remembers even what the waking brain will not. He asked about the drive north, the return, the hour, the road. Betty spoke in even sentences. She did not dramatize. She set details down like objects on a table: the light, the binoculars, the field, the beeps in the trunk, the gap in time. When she finished, the room felt somehow larger, as if the telling had opened a window. Barney kept his gaze on his hands, then raised his eyes and described only what he could say without pressing against a barrier inside himself. He spoke of the windows in the sky, of the figures that might have been figures, of the rush in his chest, of the words that had leapt out before he could choose them. "They're going to capture us," he said the sentence quietly, as if it were fragile. The doctor nodded the way physicians do when the important detail has arrived of its own accord. There was no leap toward conclusions. There were no suggestions offered in place of memory. Instead, the doctor explained the method he used for patients carrying unassimilated experience: relaxation, breathing, a guided descent into a state of focused calm where the mind can approach the edges of what it has walled off. He named it plainly: hypnosis, a controlled and ethical technique he used with veterans and civilians alike, not to plant ideas but to ease the nervous system and allow recall if recall wished to come. Not a miracle, not a performance, a slow door. He made boundaries clear. Each of them would work separately so that one person's words could not shape the others. Nothing would be forced. If at any point fear rose beyond what the body could tolerate, they would stop. He asked whether they had concerns. He asked what would help them feel safe in the room. He took notes, not many, and he set the pencil down each time either of them reached for a memory that seemed to tremble. Between questions, the room held the steady sound of a city muted by distance, a bus sighing at a stop, a bicycle bell, a child's voice crossing a sidewalk, and then fading. In that quiet, the doctor offered a simple practice: count the breath to 4, pause for 2, exhale for 6, and let the long exhale tell the body that it need not hover at the edge of alarm. They tried it there in the chairs, 2 breaths only, a small rehearsal for a deeper calm. He suggested a plan. Over several sessions they would begin with grounding, breath, a point of focus, the slow unclenching a body learns when it is allowed to rest. Only when that steadiness felt reliable would they approach the missing hours. The goal was not to manufacture a story. It was to allow any story already present to step forward without being pushed. If nothing emerged, that would be honored. If too much emerged, they would slow down and return to the breath. Nothing would be taken away from them in this room. Nothing would be added. When the hour ended, Betty felt the strange clarity that follows careful listening. Barney felt the relief that comes when a task has been named and made orderly. They scheduled separate sessions on different days. The receptionist penciled them in with unhurried strokes. As they stood to leave, the doctor mentioned something simple and practical: keep doing what steadies you. Tea at night, walks in the quieter streets, the dog at the foot of the bed. The small anchors are not small to a nervous system. They are harbors. Outside, the afternoon had softened. The buildings held the light in those shallow pools that gather on windowsills. They walked without speaking for a block, then 2. At a crosswalk, Betty looked up at the thin blue above the roofs and felt that particular tenderness the sky can have over cities, close and patient. She slipped her hand into Barney's and let it rest there, as if it had always known its way. On the train home, the rhythm returned, the mild sway, the low murmur of strangers, the country opening again beyond the glass. He closed his eyes for a moment and felt how the breath, 4 in 2 held 6 out, made a room inside his chest. She watched the fields go by and let the last of the day pass through her without gravity. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. That night, they did not try to solve anything. They did the dishes. They set out clothes for morning. They left the porch light on. Before sleep, Betty made a small note in her journal. We spoke. We were heard. A door was not opened but shown. In 2 days the first session would begin. A chair, a steady voice, the breathing they had practiced in a room where clocks did not tick. Not a hunt for answers, but a way of standing at the threshold without fear and seeing whether the darkness wished to name itself. They turned out the lights, and the house returned to its night sounds, the refrigerator's quiet hum, a distant car, the soft rhythm of their own breathing.
Somewhere beyond the roof, September gathered its cool, and the stars arranged themselves in their old patient patterns. The world was ordinary. The world contained what it had always contained, and in that ordinariness, a passage waited, lit only by attention, and the promise that nothing would be taken from them that they did not choose to give.
The room was the same each time, a chair angled slightly from the desk, curtains drawn against the daylight, the faint scent of paper and wood polish. It was not a stage. It was not an experiment. It was a place where breathing became slower, where the voice of the doctor set a rhythm softer than thought. Betty's first session began with silence. The doctor spoke only to guide her toward calm. Inhale, hold, release. A count she already knew from their earlier meeting. She followed it until her shoulders dropped and the pulse at her temple slowed. He asked her to imagine a staircase, each step carrying her deeper into rest. 10, 9, 8. The numbers softened into distance. She drifted. Her voice, when it came, was hushed, as if speaking not to him but to the stillness within herself. She described standing in the road, the lights above too close, too deliberate. She spoke of figures that emerged not with menace, but with certainty. They were smaller than she expected, their forms symmetrical, their movements quiet. She did not use the word alien. She called them beings. Their presence carried weight, but not cruelty. She felt herself guided, not dragged. The silence lingered. Barney's first descent was different. He resisted the stairway, his breaths shallow, his chest tense. The doctor did not press. Instead, he asked Barney to imagine a safe place, a room where nothing could intrude. Slowly, the edge of fear loosened. Words emerged, halting at first, then clearer. He described the windows in the sky, the faces beyond them, the impossibility of their gaze. His voice trembled and then steadied, as if a truth once locked away had been permitted to enter daylight. They looked at me. That was all he could say before his throat closed. The doctor ended the session gently, telling him even one sentence was enough. Between sessions, they lived ordinary days. Betty walked the dog down familiar streets, the leash slack in her hand. Barney repaired a fence in the yard, his hammer strikes deliberate, grounding. But in quiet moments, the sessions lingered. She woke in the night with fragments pressing forward, rooms not of wood or plaster, but of metal and light, instruments that hummed without sound. He woke with sweat on his forehead, his breath shallow, the echo of a command he had never chosen. Don't look too closely. As the weeks went on, the accounts grew fuller. Betty described a chamber that seemed both small and boundless, walls curving without corners. She spoke of examinations, gentle, clinical, as though she were an object of study rather than harm. She remembered eyes meeting hers, eyes vast and dark, carrying not anger, but something harder to name: curiosity, calculation, a kind of quiet recognition. Barney, when trust finally steadied his voice, revealed the terror he had carried alone. He spoke of being led up a narrow incline, of hands guiding his arms, though no grip was felt. He described a table of cool surface, restraints that were not metal but pressure, holding him without contact. His words slowed when he recalled their faces, not grotesque, not monstrous, but uncanny in their symmetry. Large eyes that seemed to reflect him back to himself. He said he wanted to look away, but could not. The silence lingered. The doctor kept his notes minimal, recording impressions without interpretation. He did not push them toward conclusions. He reminded them that memory under hypnosis is not proof but testimony, an inner record. What mattered was not the world's verdict, but their own release from the weight of what had been unspeakable. In the evenings, Betty and Barney would sit at their kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator behind them, and compare the smallest details. She would mention a corridor that bent in a curve. He would nod slowly, saying he had seen the same. She spoke of a sound like a low vibration, felt more than heard.
He confirmed it with a quiet yes. Each parallel made the air heavier, yet also steadier. They were not alone with their fragments. The sky was not empty. By the time autumn colored the trees, they both carried a different stillness, not peace, not certainty, but the calm that comes when a burden is shared. The sessions continued. The doctor guided, recorded, and paused when needed. He offered them not answers, but a way to inhabit their own memories without fear. And in that gentle unfolding, something larger than memory began to take shape, a sense that their lives had brushed against a mystery wider than their years, deeper than their world. The house at night held the same sounds as always, the ticking of pipes, the rustle of leaves, the distant whistle of a train, yet now, beneath those familiar rhythms, there was another sound, an echo of silence, vast and unending, that stretched beyond the roof and into the dark expanse above. They did not speak of it often, they did not need to. It was there, in every glance skyward, in every pause before sleep. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty.
Chapter 3. The Missing Time. Memory is supposed to move like a river. One moment flows into the next, carrying us smoothly downstream. But for Betty and Barney Hill, that night in September 1961, the river broke. There was a gap, an absence where hours should have been. When they first returned home in the early dawn, they noticed the small signs. The watches on their wrists had stopped, both frozen at the same time. Barney's shoes were scuffed, as if he had run across rough ground, though he had no recollection of doing so. Betty's dress bore a tear at the hem, a fabric bruise that puzzled her. Their dog, usually lively, remained subdued, curling into corners of the house as though unsettled by something unseen. At first, they tried to dismiss it. People forget things while driving. Perhaps they had dozed in shifts, or slowed along the way, or stopped without noting the hour. Perhaps the watches were simply faulty. Yet each attempt at explanation thinned quickly under the weight of strangeness. The silence lingered. Days passed. Betty, unwilling to let the matter dissolve, returned to the road where the beeping had begun. She walked the shoulder carefully, scanning the ground, the trees, the sky. Nothing. No marks, no fragments, no signs of what had pressed itself into their journey. But her conviction only deepened. Something had happened. Something neither of them could see clearly. Barney resisted. He kept his mind on work, his body in routine, the steady cadence of letters and parcels at the post office. Yet inside, a tension built. He began to wake at night, his chest tight, his dreams filled with images he could not control. He told Betty little of this, not wishing to fuel her growing obsession, but the unease lived with him like a shadow. It was Betty who first noticed the hours unaccounted for. She retraced their route, calculating the time between landmarks, comparing it to the time they had arrived home. There was a gap, nearly 2 hours missing, unanchored, absent from memory. She marked it in her journal, with simple words, "We cannot explain the time." The phrase haunted her. Missing time. It became the center of her thoughts. She began to wonder if the dreams were not merely dreams but pieces of memory pushing through. She remembered corridors of light, beings who moved with intent, voices that spoke without sound. She recalled a star map shown to her, lines connecting points of light in patterns unfamiliar. Each night the dream returned, as though the mind insisted on telling what the conscious world could not bear. Barney grew quieter. He confided once, reluctantly, that he remembered standing in a field, binoculars raised, watching the figures move inside the craft. He remembered fear, deep, primal, unlike anything he had felt before. He remembered running back to the car with words torn from his throat. "They're going to capture us." Beyond that, his memory fell into silence. The gap in their recollections became heavier than the memories themselves. It was not only the presence of strangeness, but the absence of ordinary time that troubled them most. Hours stolen, leaving only fragments in their place. Betty wrote letters to researchers. She sought out books on the subject of unidentified flying objects, though the library shelves held little. The few volumes she found spoke of lights, discs, sightings from afar. None spoke of the intimacy of being taken. None spoke of missing time. One night, unable to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table and drew what she remembered from her dreams, the star map. Dots arranged in patterns, lines connecting them like a traveler's route. She did not claim to understand it. She only knew it had been shown to her, and she could not forget. Barney avoided the subject, yet the silence cost him. His health began to falter. He developed ulcers, headaches, a weariness that sleep could not mend. The stress pressed against his heart, his body bearing the weight of what his mind refused to name. They spoke together of seeking help, not from friends, not from family, but from someone trained to listen to memory, to the spaces between words. And so they found Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist known not for spectacle but for calm. A man who had helped veterans unravel the tangles of war memory, who approached trauma not with force but with patience. It was in his office, weeks later, that the phrase missing time gained form. Under hypnosis, gently guided, Betty and Barney began to fill the silence. Their accounts were not identical, but they overlapped in unsettling ways. Each described being led, examined, spoken to without words. Each recalled details that matched without having been shared beforehand. And yet, before those sessions, before memory returned, there was only the gap, the silent hours of the drive, the watches stopped, the scuffed shoes and torn dress, the sound of beeps that no car should make. The sky above them vast and unyielding. Missing time is its own kind of haunting. Unlike a memory of terror, it cannot be replayed, cannot be faced directly. It is a hollow in the story, a pause that refuses to end. For Betty and Barney Hill, it became the quiet center of their lives, a silence they carried by day, and a silence that shaped their nights. The silence lingered, the sky was not empty. The dreams returned with quiet persistence. For Betty, sleep was no longer a refuge, but a threshold. Each night she crossed it, she found herself not in the familiar safety of her home, but in that strange corridor of light, guided by figures whose presence was neither cruel nor kind, only deliberate. She would wake in the early hours with fragments vivid enough to make her pulse quicken. A table, a curved wall, a hand reaching gently toward her elbow. She began to keep a notebook by the bed, filling its pages with sketches and notes before the images could dissolve. The drawings were precise, careful, a room without corners, a chair shaped to the body in ways no furniture maker would design. Instruments she could not name, some delicate, some sharp, all handled with the calm efficiency of those who had used them many times before. In one sketch she marked the shape of eyes, large and dark, that met hers and held them with quiet gravity. Barney read these notes with unease. He did not contradict her. He did not call them foolish, but he also did not embrace them. He would fold the pages closed, set the notebook gently aside, and leave the room. His own nights were filled with restless turning. Sometimes he would wake in a rush, heart pounding, his throat tight with words he would not speak. He remembered enough to fear remembering more. One morning, Betty asked him directly, "Do you dream of them too?" He paused, his jaw working before he answered. "No," he said quietly. "I don't dream. I see things, but I don't want to." That was all. He left for work soon after, the words hanging in the air like smoke that would not clear. The silence between them grew heavier. Betty's insistence, Barney's retreat. She could not stop pressing forward, and he could not stop pulling back. Yet they remained bound together by something neither could ignore: the missing hours. No matter how he tried, Barney could not account for the gap. No matter how she explained it, Betty could not fill it without the dreams. Friends noticed changes. Betty seemed distracted. Her thoughts turned inward. even in conversation. Barney seemed weary, carrying a tension in his shoulders, his smile thinner than before. Neither spoke openly to those around them. To share too much would invite doubt, ridicule, or worse. So the secret sat between them like a third presence at the table, silent but undeniable. It was Betty who took the next step. She began corresponding with UFO research groups, describing the light, the pursuit, the missing time. Her letters were measured, factual, careful not to sound hysterical. She wanted clarity, not sensation. She received replies, some sympathetic, some skeptical, but all acknowledging that her story was unusual. One investigator encouraged her to keep recording the dreams. Another mentioned similar accounts, lights in the sky, followed by hours unremembered. The phrase abduction was not yet common, but the pattern was there, whispered among those who studied the unexplained. Barney bristled when she showed him the letters. "They'll make us into a story," he said. "We'll be a headline, a joke," Betty answered softly. "We already are a story, Barney. We're just the only ones who don't know how to tell it yet." The tension weighed on him. His health began to suffer. Headaches spread across his skull like tightening bands. His stomach churned with ulcers. He found himself short of breath on walks that had once been easy. Doctors spoke of stress, of nerves, of strain. He nodded, but did not explain what pressed on him. How could he? Stress was a word too small for the weight of silence he carried. By autumn, it was clear they could not move forward alone. Betty's conviction grew they needed help, not from enthusiasts or skeptics, but from someone trained in the language of memory and the care of the mind. Someone who could guide them through the fog without forcing them into belief or denial. And so, after quiet discussion, they reached for the name they had been given. Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist in Boston, known for treating trauma in veterans, for his use of hypnosis as a tool, not of entertainment but of healing. He had no interest in UFOs, no stake in belief or disbelief. His concern was the mind, and the way memory hides what it cannot bear. Their first visit was not dramatic. It was cautious, gentle. Dr. Simon listened more than he spoke, his notes minimal, his voice steady. He asked about the drive, the light, the hours unaccounted for. He asked about dreams, about fear, about health. He did not press them toward answers. Instead, he suggested a path, a series of sessions, separate for each of them, where hypnosis might allow the missing time to surface, if it was there at all. He was careful. He reminded them that memory under hypnosis is not proof, but recollection, that the mind can blend dream and fact, that the subconscious does not always distinguish. He promised no revelations, only the possibility of easing the burden of not knowing. Betty agreed immediately. For her, the chance to understand outweighed the risk. Barney hesitated, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, but at last, he nodded. He could not carry the silence alone any longer. The date was set. The sessions would begin in the quiet of Dr. Simon's office, the lights low, the air steady, the voice of the physician guiding them into calm. What they would find there was uncertain, but the first step had been taken. At home that night, Betty wrote in her journal, "Perhaps the hours will return." Barney, sitting beside her, said nothing, but for the first time in weeks, he placed his hand over hers and let it rest there until sleep came. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. The first session began with breath. Dr. Simon's office held that curated quiet particular to places built for listening, thick curtains, a carpet that absorbed footfall, books that lined the walls like sober witnesses. He angled the lamp so its light fell soft, then invited Betty to sit. They spoke for a few minutes about ordinary things. Her walk from the station, the weather that had turned a degree colder, the way autumn gathers itself in the trees. And only then did he suggest they begin. "Follow the breath," he said. "We'll let the body lead." He counted with her. Inhale for 4, pause for 2, exhale for 6. She matched his cadence, and with each long exhale, another layer of vigilance released its hold. When her shoulders dropped, he spoke of a staircase that descended into calm. 10 steps, each step a little quieter than the one before. 10, 9, 8. Her voice, when it came, was steady and small, as if she were speaking to the room without asking anything of it. She described the highway first, the white lines sliding under the car, the curve where the trees opened their arms to a meadow, and then the light. "It moves with us," she said. "Not like a plane, it knows we are here." Dr. Simon asked nothing more than what arrived of its own will. He did not name, he did not suggest. He asked her to notice what her body knew. "Where do you feel it?" he asked softly. "In the wrists and the throat," she said, after a pause. "Like the air is a little thicker there." The scene shifted. She stood outside the car now, in memory. The craft hovered above the field, silent as frost. She could see, or feel, that there were figures near her, one on each side, small hands guiding rather than taking. She did not fight them. She felt an odd assurance, as if resistance would only make the air itself harder. The silence lingered. They brought her to a space that curved. The light had no source. It lay over everything evenly. There was a surface that held her weight. "Not a bed," she said, "more like a table that remembers the shape of a person." She described instruments that did not clatter, hands that moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to gentle precision. "It isn't cruel," she said, "but it isn't tender either. It's like being measured." "Notice your breath, Doctor," Simon said, and she did, returning to the slow count, letting the body reassert its space inside the scene. When he asked whether anyone spoke, she answered without opening her eyes. "Not with mouths. I understand them the way you understand a road you've walked 100 times. They say, it will not take long." She felt a light pressure along the ribs, a touch at the elbow, a coolness behind one ear that was more idea than sensation, like the memory of a breeze. She spoke of eyes, dark, reflective, large enough that she could see a soft impression of herself in them, as though a pond were holding her image without ripple. "They are not angry," she said. "They are interested." When the session neared its end, Dr. Simon asked her to find a place in the room, on the back of her hand, perhaps, or at the center of her chest where she felt safe. She touched her palm lightly. "Here," she said. He counted the staircase in reverse, 1, 2, 3, and invited her to bring the room back into focus. She opened her eyes slowly, as though the light in the office had traveled a long way to find her. Outside, she sat for a moment on the bench in the hall before collecting her coat. The floorboards clicked once underfoot. She did not try to hold the details too tightly. She let them settle, like snow that knows exactly where it will land. 2 days later, it was Barney's turn. He arrived early and stood at the window, hands folded, watching the bare branches tremble against the city's muted sky. In the chair, he kept his back straight until breathwork softened its angles. Dr. Simon used fewer words this time, sensing the tautness in the way Barney held himself against his own interior. "Notice the places that feel steady," the doctor said. "My feet," Barney answered, surprised. "They know where the floor is." The descent was slower. At first, his mind circled the outskirts. The clock on the post office wall, the swing of a mailbag, the creak of a familiar stair, before it allowed the road back in. When it did, it brought the binoculars immediately. He was standing in the field again, hands raised, glass pressed to the bone around his eyes. The craft filled his view, the windows, the figures, the sensation of being the object, not the observer. Dr. Simon's questions were nearly breaths themselves. "What happens now?" "They look at me," Barney said. The word they caught in his throat. His hands gripped the chair. "Come back to the feet," the doctor said gently. "Then look again if you wish." He did. The scene held. He saw the figures lean slightly in unison. He could not say how he knew, only that he did. They intended for him to be still. He felt stillness arrive like a temperature change. No straps, no hands pinning him, only the air itself settling in a way that made movement feel impolite. "It's not a command," he said, surprised at his own phrasing. "It's expectation." The next moments came in fragments. A slope, not a ramp, exactly. More like the ground becoming less like ground, and then a space where sound didn't carry. He was on a surface that was cooler than skin. He felt pressure across his thighs and chest that belonged to nothing he could see. "Like being held by a decision," he said, and then fell quiet. "Stay with the breath," Dr. Simon reminded him. Barney nodded, eyes closed. He described their faces with the care of a man who has learned not to waste words. Smooth, pale ash, eyes that were not black so much as depth itself. He could not fix their expressions because they seemed to contain too many expressions at once. Attention, thought, something like calculation, softened by ritual. He felt to his surprise a small thread of embarrassment. "They are studying," he said, almost apologizing. "I am part of it." When a tremor moved through his jaw, the doctor slowed the scene by returning him to anchors. The weight of his heels, the steadiness of the chair's wooden arms, the sound of his own breath, the shaking eased. From that steadier place he named details that surprised him in their ordinariness. A texture like brushed metal where the table met his wrist. A dim, low vibration that felt more like touch than sound. A faint sweetness on the air, as if the room held the memory of something floral, long after the flower had gone. He did not speak of pain. He did speak of fear, but not the frantic kind. This fear was clean, bright, almost architectural. The knowledge that he was inside a structure of intention he could not interpret. "I want to look away," he said softly, "but the looking is part of what is happening." When the hour ended, Dr. Simon brought him back with the same care he had used to lead him down. 4 in, 2 held, 6 out. Then the steady count up the staircase. At 3, Barney's hands loosened. At 7, his jaw unclenched. At 10, he opened his eyes, and the office arranged itself around him, as rooms do when the mind is ready to see them. They did not compare notes together in the office. The sessions were kept separate by design. But at home, that evening, something small changed in the way they sat beside each other. The silence between them lost its edge. Betty poured tea, and he did not look away when she set the cup down. She placed her palm on the table where she had touched it in session, and he mirrored the gesture with his own hand, not quite touching hers, as if they were both acknowledging a boundary they could, when ready, cross. The days that followed held ordinary weather, ordinary errands, yet the edges of the missing hours had begun to round, not filled, never forced, but rounded, the way shorelines do when the tide returns in patient, regular breaths. They spoke little of content, more of how the sessions felt, lighter in the chest, heavier at the wrists, a quiet behind the eyes. The body, having been heard, was beginning to set its own bones. Dr. Simon continued, careful to keep each session from crowding the next. He wrote notes that were more cadence than narrative. Breath settled, language precise, fear acknowledged, not enlarged. When asked by a colleague why he thought the recall came as it did, clean, clinical, threaded with ritual, he simply said, "We are not making a case, we are making room." Outside, the season leaned closer to winter. The air carried that fine, metallic scent that comes when the sky clears after rain. The nights were crisp and exact, and somewhere in that clarity, the hills were learning to stand beside what they could not explain without letting it own their days. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. The sessions did not end with the telling. They lingered in the fabric of daily life, subtle at first, then shaping the rhythm of the hill's existence. In Portsmouth, the house on a quiet street looked much the same as it always had. Betty tending her small garden, Barney leaving for work in his pressed suit, neighbors waving politely. Yet beneath those ordinary motions ran a new current, an underflow of images and impressions that had been waiting for their chance to surface. The missing hours no longer stood as an empty canyon in their minds. Fragments now lined its edges, giving shape to what had once been void. But shape is not always comfort. Betty, who had once carried her dreams in silence, now felt them echoed by the sessions. They were no longer only nocturnal visions, they were corroborated memories, pulled forth under the calm cadence of Dr. Simon's voice. She began to keep a fresh journal, each entry written in steady, deliberate script. Not everything went on the page, only the details she felt were anchored, light without source, hands that guided, the star map that shimmered like memory and command. The act of writing steadied her, as though putting words down might keep the memories from shifting again. Barney was slower to accept what came. His temperament, rooted in caution and practicality, resisted the notion that his mind could yield such images. Yet he could not dismiss the weight of them. The steady rhythm of the hypnosis left him with impressions too detailed to be invention, too consistent to ignore. He found himself pausing at odd moments, waiting at a traffic light, standing in the post office line, when the memory of those dark, reflective eyes would surface, not with menace, but with a depth that unsettled. He spoke little of it to others, but Betty could see the change in his quiet. Dr. Simon kept meticulous notes. In his careful handwriting, he recorded not only what was said, but how it was said, the tone, the pace, the pauses heavy with unsaid meaning. He noted the congruence between their accounts. He noted also the emotion, Betty's calm, Barney's fear. He was cautious not to pronounce conclusions. To him, the sessions revealed truths of memory, and whether those truths pointed to external events or internal constructs was a matter for time to test. Yet he could not ignore the consistency, nor the profound effect on his patients. The work was not about proving, it was about giving space. Outside the office, life carried on. The world did not stop to consider two people's missing hours. At the post office, Betty waited in line for stamps, overhearing ordinary chatter about weather and groceries. At the bank, Barney filled out slips with the same practiced hand as always, but in the privacy of their evenings, the silence between them now carried recognition. They did not need to speak every detail. The shared weight of memory was its own language, a glance at the kitchen table, a pause before bed. These were sentences enough. The broader world, of course, had its own rhythms. Newspapers carried stories of rockets tested in the desert, of tensions rising abroad, of new machines that promised to shrink distances and quicken time. UFO reports appeared and faded, one headline replaced by another. For the Hills, however, the phenomenon was no longer distant rumor. It was not a tale overheard in a diner. It was in their bodies, their nights, their silence. Betty sometimes stood at the window in the small hours, looking at the stars. She no longer saw them as distant pinpricks only. They were coordinates, possibilities, destinations. The star map shown in memory lingered with her, patterns of points and lines, some familiar, others foreign. She traced them in her mind like a puzzle that would not quite resolve. There was a strange comfort in it too. If her experience was real, then humanity was not alone. The universe held neighbors, however enigmatic. If it was not real, then at least her mind had granted her a story of vastness rather than confinement. Barney's reflections were more guarded. For him, the experience was not reassurance but intrusion. The thought that unknown hands had guided him, measured him, studied him, it unsettled his sense of sovereignty over his own body. He carried himself with quiet dignity in public, but the private fear was harder to set down. Still, the sessions gave him a kind of framework. What was once an amorphous dread had shape now, and shape, however daunting, is easier to bear than shapeless void. Dr. Simon, in his summaries, often returned to the theme of memory's burden.
He noted how both patients seemed lighter after each session, as though naming the unspeakable reduced its power. Yet he also observed the paradox. With clarity came consequence. Their lives would never return to the innocence of the drive before the lights descended. The missing time, once hidden, had become part of them, and once seen it could not be unseen. The wider community, for the most part, remained unaware of the depth of what was unfolding. Friends and colleagues might notice Betty's new intensity, Barney's slight withdrawal, but they did not connect it to anything extraordinary, and that was perhaps for the best. Extraordinary stories, spoken too soon, can become cages. For now, the Hills let the truth breathe in private, under the careful watch of the doctor who listened. As autumn deepened, and the air sharpened with approaching winter, the Hills walked sometimes together in the evenings. The streets of Portsmouth glowed faintly with lamps. The houses kept their warmth inside. They walked in companionable silence, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant sound of a train. In those moments, the mystery seemed less threatening. The world remained steady in its ordinary details, and within that steadiness, the extraordinary could be carried without breaking. Yet the sky was never entirely ordinary again. Every star overhead carried with it the question. Every silence held the echo of that lost time. The Hills did not speak of it daily, but they lived with it always, like a second current beneath the visible stream. The missing time was no longer only a gap, it was a presence. It had shape, voice, memory. And though it had been retrieved in whispers under hypnosis, it now lived in the waking hours too. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty.
Chapter 4. Under Hypnosis. The full story emerges. Hypnosis is not a key that unlocks doors with a single turn. It is more like a slow tide rising, coaxing what lies beneath to surface in its own time. For Betty and Barney Hill, the sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon became that tide, gentle, methodical, patient. With each appointment, fragments returned, until the empty hours of that September night began to take form. The accounts did not arrive as polished narratives. They came in pieces, sometimes clear, sometimes broken, like shards of glass, reflecting the same light from different angles. Dr. Simon guided without forcing. He never told them what they had seen. He only asked what the mind wished to show. Betty's recollections often arrived with calm clarity. She described herself being led from the car, not pulled but guided. The figures were small, perhaps no taller than her chest. Their movements were smooth, practiced, precise. She noted the way their hands rested lightly at her elbows, steady but not rough, as if they had done this countless times before. She remembered Barney walking behind her. His steps were slower, heavier, his body moving with reluctance though not resistance. She felt his fear even in memory, the way the silence around him grew taut. The beings did not speak aloud, yet somehow Betty understood their intent. They wanted her calm. They wanted compliance without violence. The message came not as words but as a current. She sensed beneath their actions, "You will not be harmed. This is a process." When Dr. Simon asked what happened once she entered the craft, Betty described a space that curved in every direction. The walls were seamless, as if molded from a single material. Light filled the room, without a source, bathing everything in a steady glow. There was a chair, or something like a chair, waiting. She was asked to sit. Instruments were arranged nearby. She did not know their names, but she remembered their shapes: long rods, delicate probes, small containers like vials. "They examined me," she said softly under trance, not unkindly, not like a doctor with a bedside manner, more like a technician, recording data, collecting samples. "They touched my skin with something cool, like metal. They scraped gently at the surface of my arm. They looked at my eyes, my ears. They took a strand of hair. It was all clinical." She spoke of one figure who seemed different from the rest, standing slightly apart, observing more than acting. She thought of him as a leader, not because of stature but because the others seemed to glance toward him before they moved. From him she felt a steadier presence, as though he carried both authority and a sense of reassurance. Barney's recollections were harder won. His first sessions revealed flashes only, the windows of the craft, the eyes looking back, the feeling of paralysis. But with repetition, the scenes lengthened. Under hypnosis, his voice grew strained, his body tensed in the chair. He spoke of being led up an incline, though his legs felt heavy, as though he were wading through water. He described being placed on a table. It was cool, smooth, and molded to fit his back. He felt pressure across his chest and thighs, invisible yet inescapable. He remembered the beings leaning over him, their faces large in proportion, eyes reflecting him back at himself. He could not look away. "They told me not to be afraid," he said once, voice trembling, "but I was. I couldn't stop it. I thought I would die there, not because they hurt me, but because I didn't understand what I was to them." The procedures mirrored Betty's account: examinations, instruments, samples. Yet Barney's memory carried more terror. Where Betty felt clinical detachment, Barney felt exposure. The act of being studied was, to him, unbearable. The being's silence pressed against him like weight, and yet even in his fear, he described details that matched hers: the curved walls, the seamless light, the sense of one figure holding greater authority, a leader whose presence steadied the others, the strange wordless communication, thoughts that arrived without sound, impressions felt rather than spoken. Dr. Simon noted the consistency carefully. He had kept their sessions separate, ensuring one did not hear the other's account. Yet when he compared his notes, the overlap was striking. Two people, recalling under trance the same environment, the same procedures, the same leader-like figure. He recorded the descriptions without embellishment, cautious of what such congruence meant. In one of Betty's most vivid recollections, she spoke of being shown a map. It was not on paper, nor a screen, but projected before her as if suspended in air. Points of light connected by lines, some double, some single, as though denoting routes. She asked where it was, what it meant. The leader figure responded with the impression of travel, of trade, of connection between stars. When she pressed further, "Where are you from?" the figure gave a kind of answer, not in words but in a sense of direction, a gesture of mind rather than hand. Later, she would attempt to reproduce it in sketches, careful dots and lines that others would study for years. For Barney, the most searing memory was of the eyes. He spoke of them often, of their depth, of their stillness. "I wanted to look away," he said, "but the looking was part of it, like they were searching me through my gaze." His fear was raw, his voice cracking under hypnosis, but it carried the ring of truth, as lived experience often does. By the close of these sessions, the missing hours were no longer missing. They were filled with memory, with fragments of an encounter that defied easy explanation. For Betty, they were shaped by curiosity, even a strange sense of privilege at having seen what others had not. For Barney, they were haunted by fear, a wound not of the body, but of the spirit. Dr. Simon sat with both, listening, recording, withholding judgment. In his reports, he wrote with clinical distance: subjects recall under hypnosis a shared experience of abduction, examination, and release by non-human entities. Consistency notable, emotional response significant. But in the quiet of his office, he knew the Hills carried more than testimony. They carried the weight of having stood together at the boundary between the ordinary and the inexplicable. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. Betty's second session unfolded with a steadiness that surprised even her. She lay back in the chair, breathing slow and measured, her body sinking into the calm rhythm Dr. Simon guided. The staircase in her mind appeared again, 10 steps downward, each one quieter than the last. When she reached the bottom, the walls of the office seemed to dissolve. She was once more on the road, but soon the memory carried her farther, into the space she had resisted, naming aloud. "They took me to a room," she said softly. "It curved, like a circle turned inside out. The walls were close, but they had no edges. It was bright, but not from lamps. The light was just there, in the air. She described sitting in the chair, instruments surrounding her. Small hands moved across her arms and shoulders, lifting, touching, recording. One of the beings pressed something cool and narrow against her skin. Another clipped a strand of hair. She recalled their precision, the way each movement was both efficient and quiet, like a routine long practiced. And then came the image that would mark her memory forever. The star map. It wasn't on a wall, she whispered. It floated, like dots of light, suspended in air. Some were closer, some farther. There were lines connecting them, straight lines like rotes, some single, some double. I knew, without anyone saying, that the double lines were important. Trade, maybe. Travel. She leaned forward slightly in the chair, eyes still closed, voice steady in trance. I asked them where they were from. The one who seemed in charge. The leader, he answered. Not with words, but with a feeling, a gesture. He showed me a point, then traced along the lines, showing the way to other stars. I understood it as origin, as home, but I don't know where. Dr. Simon made careful notes. He did not ask for names of stars. He did not suggest locations. He only let her describe what she saw. Later she would draw the map with pencil and ruler, dots arranged with lines threading them. Years afterward, researchers would pore over it, searching for familiar constellations, debating whether it matched Zeta Reticuli or some other system. But in that moment, it was only what Betty recalled, a geometry of light etched into her mind. Barney's next session was more turbulent. He settled into the chair reluctantly, his breathing shallow at first. Dr. Simon guided him gently, returning always to the breath, to the feet planted on the ground. Slowly, Barney let go, sinking into the current of memory. But when it carried him back into the craft, his body tensed. "They are around me," he said, voice low and strained. Small, watching. Their eyes so large, I cannot move. I feel exposed. His hands gripped the arms of the chair. Dr. Simon reminded him of the breath, the steadiness of the present moment. Barney's shoulders eased slightly, but his voice shook. "They are over me. I am on the table. They are touching me, but I don't feel their hands. It's like pressure, like the air itself is holding me down." He described instruments pressed against his chest, against his head. He felt something touch his eyes, prying them open when he wanted to look away. "I want to close them, but I can't. They make me see. They are in my eyes." His breathing quickened. Dr. Simon slowed the pace, encouraging him back to anchors, the sound of the clock, the feel of the chair, the rhythm of exhale. The panic softened, but Barney continued, voice hoarse. "They tell me without words, be still. It will be quick, but I am afraid. I am so afraid." For Betty, the leader figure had been reassuring. For Barney, those same eyes were unbearable. He spoke of them as overwhelming, as if they searched through him, stripping away his defenses. "I don't belong to myself," he whispered. "They are inside me, watching from the inside." The session ended gently, Dr. Simon guiding him back up the staircase of numbers, back into the safe container of the room. When Barney opened his eyes, his face was pale, his body damp with sweat. He sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "I don't want to remember more," he said, "but I know it's true." Dr. Simon's notes reflected the difference. Betty's memories carried detail, precision, even curiosity. Barney's carried terror, resistance, a sense of violation. Yet both spoke of the same elements: the curved rooms, the seamless light, the leader figure, the examinations, the wordless communication. The congruence was undeniable. Outside the office, the Hills lived with the aftermath of each session. Betty felt a growing compulsion to understand, to contextualize. She reread her journal entries, added sketches, even began comparing her recollections with star charts.
She was convinced that what she had seen had meaning beyond her own experience. Barney, however, sought escape from the weight. He buried himself in work, in household chores, in the predictable cadence of daily life. Yet his health showed the cost. Ulcers worsened, sleep grew lighter. His laughter, once ready, became rare. Still, he stayed beside Betty, bound not only by love, but by the fact that no one else on earth shared the burden of that night as she did. Dr. Simon, reviewing the transcripts, reflected on the paradox of their accounts. To him, hypnosis revealed truths of the psyche. He was not quick to label them as evidence of external visitation, but he also recognized that what they recalled under trance was consistent, intricate, and emotionally charged. It was not invention born of whim, it was memory, whether rooted in physical reality or deep dream. And either way, it demanded respect. By the end of those sessions, the missing time had acquired form, no longer empty hours, but filled with scenes of examination, of eyes that spoke without sound, of maps traced across the stars. For Betty, it was revelation. For Barney, it was wound. For both, it was indelible. The silence lingered, the sky was not empty.
The sessions deepened with each visit, carrying Betty and Barney further into the hollow of memory. What began as fragments, hands on the elbows, light without source, eyes too large to belong to men, grew into fuller recollections. Yet the further they traveled, the more their emotions diverged. For Betty, the memories carried a strange clarity, sometimes even fascination. For Barney, they pressed against the edges of terror. In one session, Betty again described the star map. This time the image appeared to her, not as a still chart, but as if it lived, stars pulsing faintly, the lines between them shimmering as though they carried movement. She described certain points brighter than others, anchor stars with routes connecting them. She sensed a system of navigation, not random but deliberate, the way roads connect towns. They showed me, she said, under trance, her voice calm, where they come from. They travel between stars as we travel between cities. The map is their sky, they know it as we know our roads. Doctor, Simon asked gently, did you recognize the stars? No, she whispered, they are not constellations I know, but I feel the meaning of them. This is home, this is destination, these are routes. Later, when she was fully awake, Betty would try to reproduce the pattern on paper. She drew carefully, her pencil steady, the memory vivid enough to resist fading. Years later, researchers would compare her sketch to known star systems, some claiming it aligned with Zeta Reticuli. But in those sessions, the drawing was not a claim, it was testimony, a record of what she believed she had seen. Barney's sessions, by contrast, carried him to breaking points. In one, he recalled the table more vividly than before. He described the way his body felt pinned by pressure, though no straps were visible. He spoke of instruments pressed against his groin, of samples taken that left him humiliated, stripped of dignity. His voice grew ragged as he relived the helplessness. I can't move, he whispered. They're over me, their faces so close. I want to turn away, but I can't. They are inside my head. At this point, his breathing quickened, his body trembling in the chair. Doctor, Simon paused the regression, guiding him gently back to the rhythm of the breath. He reminded Barney that he was safe, that the office was present, that the memory could be set down at any time. Slowly, the panic receded, but the weight remained. Afterward, Barney sat in silence for a long while. He admitted to Dr. Simon that he dreaded each session, yet felt compelled to continue. The memories frightened him, but the not knowing frightened him more. He wanted release, even if release came through fear. Dr. Simon noted the emotional contrast between the two. Betty seemed to find reassurance in the orderliness of the experience, the beings clinical, their actions purposeful. Barney, however, experienced the same events as deeply violating. For him, the silence of the beings was not calm but oppressive. Where Betty sensed communication,
Barney felt invasion. The doctor, trained in the nuances of trauma, considered these responses carefully. He did not claim to know whether the events were literal encounters or symbolic representations of unconscious fears, but he knew that for both patients, the experiences were real in their impact. The tears, the trembling, the calm detail, these were not performances. They were lived emotions, returning with force. In one of Betty's later sessions, she recalled asking the beings why they had chosen her. She remembered a response, not in words, but in an impression. It was like being told, "You are convenient, you were here. It is not personal, only circumstance." She spoke the words with a strange serenity, as if accepting the randomness of being swept into something larger than herself. Barney, however, could not accept such detachment. His fear was rooted in meaninglessness. To be studied, sampled, observed without explanation, that was the heart of his terror. For Betty, the encounter left her curious about the stars. For Barney, it left him fractured, his trust in the world unsettled. Outside the sessions, their lives reflected these differences. Betty spoke more openly now, her journal filling with details, her letters to researchers more confident. She felt almost chosen, though she never used the word. Barney, in contrast, withdrew. He smiled less, slept poorly, carried the look of a man holding something too heavy to set down. Dr. Simon's reports grew thicker. He described Betty's accounts as vivid, consistent, coherent, with detail unlikely to be fabricated. He described Barney's as emotionally raw, filled with fear that seemed authentic, not constructed. He noted the convergence of details between them despite their separate sessions. He admitted, cautiously, that such congruence was difficult to explain purely as coincidence. Yet he also emphasized restraint. He did not declare that extraterrestrial beings had taken them. He framed the sessions as explorations of memory, shaped by trauma, filtered by subconscious. Still, in his private reflections, he acknowledged that he had rarely seen such consistent accounts from two people under separate hypnosis. For the Hills, the impact was not theoretical, it was lived. Their missing time now had shape. The gap was filled, not with clarity, but with memories they could neither fully accept nor dismiss. Their nights were quieter. In one sense, the questions were no longer empty, but they were heavier in another, because the answers carried weight they had never sought. Betty sometimes spoke of the map, tracing lines in the air with her finger, wondering aloud if someday astronomers would recognize it. Barney sometimes sat in silence, staring at the floor, his hands folded tightly together, as though holding himself in place. The sessions gave them memory, but memory brought its own burden. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. By late winter, the sessions had drawn to a kind of natural close. What began as fragments of unease had become structured narratives, consistent, detailed, weighted with emotion. Simon, cautious as always, noted that the Hills had reached a point where further regression risked repetition rather than revelation. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be felt had already broken the surface. Betty's final sessions carried less fear and more reflection. She spoke again of the beings, their clinical manner, the calm precision of their movements. She emphasized the presence of the leader figure, the one who seemed to direct without raising a hand, who offered her the star map as though it were a lesson. She no longer trembled when she described them. Instead, she spoke as someone who had been shown a mystery, even entrusted with a glimpse of something vast. They weren't cruel, she told Dr. Simon softly. They were efficient, detached, like scientists. I don't think they meant us harm. They just wanted to know. Barney's final sessions were different. They still carried tremors of fear. His body often stiffened when the eyes returned to him in memory. He repeated that he felt stripped, studied, reduced, and yet even he admitted that the beings had not sought to injure him. They had sought to measure. For him, that fact was not comfort, but violation. To be seen so thoroughly without choice left him shaken.
When Dr. Simon asked what he wanted from remembering, Barney hesitated before answering. To carry it without breaking, he whispered. That's all. The doctor's notes reflected the divide, Betty's account colored with curiosity, Barney's with trauma, yet the congruence between them could not be denied. Both recalled the curved rooms, the seamless light, the examinations, the leader, the silent communication. Both remembered the moment of release, being led back to the car, dazed, compliant, as though nothing had happened. The engine, waiting, the road, ready, the hours gone. After the final session, Dr. Simon sat with the Hills in his office, not in trance, but in ordinary conversation. He spoke plainly. What you have recalled may or may not represent literal events. What matters is that these memories are real to you, and the emotions they carry are authentic. That is the weight you bear, and that is the weight you have now shared. He reminded them that hypnosis was not proof. Memories under trance were subject to distortion, to the blending of dream and reality. He could not tell them with certainty whether they had been aboard a craft, but he could tell them that the experience, whatever its origin, had left marks as real as any physical scar. For Betty, that was enough. She left the office with a strange lightness, as though she had been given permission to believe what her heart already knew. For Barney, it was more complicated. He felt both relief and heaviness, relief that the memories were no longer trapped in silence, heaviness that they existed at all. At home, the Hills began adjusting to life after hypnosis. Betty spoke more freely, no longer confined to her journal. She wrote letters to researchers, shared her star map sketches, and engaged cautiously with those who took an interest in UFO reports. She found in the story a kind of mission, not to convince the world, but to preserve what she and Barney had endured. Barney kept quieter. He carried himself with the same dignity as always, but those close to him noticed the change. His laughter was rarer, his silences longer. The memory of eyes that had held him captive did not leave easily. He tried to find steadiness in routine, the post office, the yard, the familiar comfort of tasks well done, but the sky above never looked the same again. Dr. Simon, in his professional writings, maintained distance. He framed the Hills case as an example of how trauma and suggestion can shape memory, but also acknowledged the uniqueness of their consistency. He never declared belief in extraterrestrial visitors, yet neither did he dismiss the Hills. He had sat in the room with them, heard the tremors in Barney's voice, seen the calm conviction in Betty's. Whatever had happened, it had happened deeply. Outside their circle, whispers of the Hills story began to circulate. Investigators from UFO groups passed along notes. Writers asked questions. A narrative was beginning to form, one that would soon enter books and broadcasts. But in these first months after hypnosis, the Hills lived quietly with their truth, guarding it, carrying it between themselves and their doctor. The missing hours had been filled, not with certainty, not with resolution, but with memory. For Betty, those memories became evidence of something wondrous, proof that humanity was not alone. For Barney, they were a burden, a reminder that control can be taken even without harm. For both, they were indelible. On quiet evenings, Betty sometimes traced the star map again, her pencil moving carefully over paper. Barney, seated nearby, would watch her without speaking. He no longer argued. He no longer dismissed. He only sat in silence, the weight of his own memories pressing inward. The road home from Montreal had been just one night in their lives, yet it had become the axis around which the rest of their years would turn. The silence of those hours, once an empty gap, was now a chorus of voices: fear, wonder, confusion, awe. And so, as the chapter of hypnosis closed, another began, the chapter of living with what they had uncovered. Chapter 5: The Star Map and Evidence. The sessions had ended, but the story did not close with them. If anything, they opened a new chapter, one where memory took on the weight of evidence. For Betty, the most tangible piece was the star map. It remained vivid in her mind long after the trance had lifted. She remembered the dots, some bright, some dim. She remembered the lines, singles and doubles, the doubles always stronger, as if showing the main routes. She remembered the leader who had shown her, not in words, but in gesture, where they came from and how they traveled. At home, she sat at the kitchen table with a ruler and pencil, drawing carefully. Each dot was measured, each line deliberate. She was not an astronomer, but she knew the importance of accuracy. When she was finished, the paper bore an image both simple and haunting, a web of stars, a set of pathways across the night sky. Barney watched her quietly as she worked. He did not stop her. He did not mock. He only folded his hands and let her trace what had imprinted itself on her. For him, the eyes were still the core of memory, their weight, their silence. For her, the map was the lasting artifact, something external she could show to others. She shared the drawing with researchers at NICAP, who studied it with interest, but admitted they could not match it to any known chart. Astronomers she approached were polite, but skeptical. The sky is vast, they reminded her. A random set of dots and lines could resemble countless arrangements. Betty listened, but held to her conviction. This was not random, it was memory. It was not until years later that the map drew wider attention. A teacher and amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish took an interest. She painstakingly built three-dimensional models of nearby star systems, hanging beads from strings to represent suns in space. When viewed from certain angles, she found that Betty's map bore resemblance to a region known as Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system, about 39 light-years away. To Fish, the match seemed significant. To skeptics, it was coincidence. To Betty, it was confirmation. But the map was not the only piece of evidence the hills carried. From the night itself, there were physical traces, the watches that had stopped, Barney's shoes, scuffed as if he had run, Betty's dress, torn at the hem, and later showing odd pink stains that resisted explanation. The car, with its strange circular marks on the trunk, areas where a compass needle spun wildly when held near. Neighbors and friends witnessed some of these anomalies. Betty showed them the compass spinning, watched their surprise as the needle wavered and spun when placed near the shiny spots. Skeptics argued the marks could be from ordinary wear, that compasses can behave oddly near metallic surfaces. Still, the strangeness unsettled those who saw it firsthand. Betty preserved the dress, keeping it folded carefully. She noted each stain, each tear, as though it were a relic. Years later, samples would be tested, but results would remain inconclusive. The dress, like the map, became an artifact, not of proof, but of persistence, a thread tying memory to matter. For Barney, the evidence was less material. His testimony under hypnosis, his trembling voice, his sweat-damp hands, these were his proofs. He was not eager to present them to the world, but those who listened heard authenticity in his fear. Dr. Simon himself, cautious and clinical, admitted that Barney's emotional response was profound, beyond what one would expect from fabrication. The Hills did not seek fame. They did not rush to newspapers. They confided in a small circle, and only gradually did their story reach wider audiences. When it did, the evidence, the map, the dress, the compass, the hypnosis transcripts became central. Believers cited them as corroboration. Skeptics dissected them as coincidence, contamination, suggestion, and yet, the weight of the evidence was not in laboratories or lectures. It was in the lives of the Hills themselves. Betty, who spoke with steady conviction, Barney, who carried the fear but did not break beneath it. Together, they bore the silence of missing time, now filled with fragments that refused to vanish. On quiet evenings, Betty sometimes unfolded the map again, tracing the lines with her fingertip. Barney would glance at her, then at the stars outside the window. He would not speak of Zeta Reticuli or of interstellar travel, but he would nod, as if acknowledging that the memory, whatever its origin, was now part of them. The star map did not remain a private sketch for long. Betty, who had learned by then that silence brought no peace, began sharing it with trusted correspondents. She sent careful letters enclosing copies of her drawing, explaining that it came from memory under hypnosis. She did not exaggerate. She wrote plainly, "This is what I was shown. I do not know what it means. I only know I did not invent it." The responses were varied. Some researchers received her words with seriousness, noting the unusual geometry of the map and the conviction with which she described it. Others dismissed it as fantasy. A scattering of dots and lines, one astronomer replied, could resemble countless formations if looked at from enough angles. The vastness of the sky, he reminded her, offers infinite patterns to those who wish to see them. Betty accepted the criticism with patience. She was not seeking to convince the unwilling. Yet she persisted, writing again, sending the map to others, keeping the conversation alive. Each letter was a way of lifting the weight from her shoulders, placing the memory into the wider world where it could live beyond her alone. It was in the mid-1960s that her map drew the attention of Marjorie Fish, a school teacher with a passion for astronomy. Patient and methodical, Fish spent years building three-dimensional models of local star systems. She hung beads from strings, suspended in space, so she could view the stars from different perspectives. To her astonishment, when viewed from one angle, Betty's map seemed to align with a region of the galaxy around Zeta Reticuli. The double lines matched double stars, the single lines matched plausible travel routes. For believers, this was vindication. Betty's memory, they argued, was not random but rooted in a reality she could not have known otherwise. For skeptics, it was still coincidence, an artifact of pattern recognition in an infinite sky. Yet even they admitted the resemblance was striking. Betty took comfort in the possibility. She did not claim proof. She simply felt less alone in believing that what she had seen was not dream but memory. Beyond the map, there were other traces. The torn dress she had worn that night, still marked with strange pink stains. She sent pieces for analysis. Laboratories found no ordinary dye or chemical to explain the discoloration, though results were never conclusive enough to silence doubt. The dress remained folded in her drawer, a quiet relic of that September night. The car, too, bore its mysteries. The circular spots on the trunk, smooth, shiny patches where paint seemed altered, remained long after. Betty demonstrated the compass trick for visitors, how the needle spun wildly near the marks, only to steady when moved away. Some were startled. Others shrugged, suggesting magnetized particles or natural interference. Yet those who saw it firsthand seldom forgot the unease it stirred. Barney contributed less to this growing archive of evidence. For him, the memory was burden enough. He had no wish to preserve objects or to mail fragments of their night to strangers. His scuffed shoes he replaced, his stopped watch he set aside. The weight he carried was internal, his trembling voice under hypnosis, his tears, his dread of those dark eyes. To him, that was evidence enough. Researchers who visited the hills were struck by the contrast. Betty was open, articulate, eager to provide details. Barney was cautious, reserved, sometimes reluctant even to speak. Their differences only made their story more compelling. If invention had been their goal, surely they would have been more consistent, more polished. Instead, their testimony bore the uneven edges of lived experience, curiosity on one side, fear on the other. In the broader UFO community, the Hills case became a touchstone. For some, it was the first credible report of abduction, the one that shaped the narrative for decades to come. For others, it was a case study in suggestion, in how dreams and hypnosis could fabricate belief. Books began to appear, drawing from the Hills' testimony. Journalists visited Portsmouth, their notebooks filling with quotes. Betty welcomed the attention cautiously. She wanted the story told, but she did not seek celebrity. Barney, however, recoiled from the glare. His health, already fragile, worsened under the strain. He felt exposed not only by the beings he remembered, but by the public gaze that followed.
At times, he wished they had never spoken at all. Dr. Simon, for his part, kept his stance measured. In interviews, he stressed that hypnosis is not proof of objective reality. He suggested that the Hills' memories could be the product of trauma, shaped by suggestion, reinforced by Betty's dreams. Yet even as he spoke with caution, he acknowledged the power of their testimony. It was consistent, detailed, and above all, sincere. The debate that swirled around them, belief versus skepticism, was almost secondary to the Hills themselves. What mattered most was that they now carried memories they had once lost. Memories that shaped their nights, their conversations, their very sense of the sky above. One evening, Betty sat at the kitchen table, her star map spread before her. She traced the lines again with her fingertip, then looked up at Barney. "Do you believe it?" she asked softly. Barney paused, considering. He did not answer with enthusiasm, nor did he dismiss it. He only said, "I believe you believe it." For Betty, that was enough. For Barney, it was all he could give.
By the mid-1960s, the Hills' story had moved beyond their kitchen table, beyond the quiet sessions in Dr. Simon's office. What had begun as whispers shared in confidence now threaded its way into a wider conversation, one that stretched across living rooms, lecture halls, and eventually, bookshelves. The star map was at the center of that expansion. Betty, encouraged by correspondence, continued to circulate her drawing when Marjorie Fish announced her interpretation that the pattern bore resemblance to the Zeta Reticuli system. UFO enthusiasts seized upon it as breakthrough. To them, it was evidence that the Hills had not only been taken, but shown a chart of genuine interstellar travel. To skeptics, it was pattern matching, the mind's tendency to find order where none exists. The debate grew sharper with every retelling. Articles began to appear in small journals, then in larger publications. Headlines asked whether a Portsmouth couple had truly been abducted by beings from another world. The words alien abduction, once fringe, began to enter public vocabulary. Betty and Barney did not seek these headlines, but the story, once loose in the world, was no longer theirs alone. Betty handled the attention with a curious steadiness. She answered questions when they came, always careful, always calm. She presented her map, her journal, her memories. She did not embellish, she did not dramatize. Her conviction was plain in its simplicity. "This happened to us, this is what I recall." Barney struggled more. Each retelling reopened wounds he preferred to let scar. He disliked the scrutiny, the skeptical questions that seemed less about understanding and more about ridicule. His fear had been private, raw, a tremor in his voice under hypnosis. To see it dissected in print felt like another violation. He withdrew further, preferring silence to debate. Dr. Simon, too, found himself drawn into the storm. He gave measured interviews, clarifying that hypnosis could not prove objective events. Yet he admitted the Hills' consistency was remarkable. In his medical view, their sincerity was unquestionable, even if the interpretation of their memories remained open. His cautious stance pleased few, too skeptical for believers, too open for debunkers, but it was honest. The evidence itself continued to circulate. The dress with its strange stains, the car with its compass-spinning spots, the star map with its haunting geometry, all were discussed, photographed, written about. Scientists examined them with varying conclusions. Some found anomalies worth noting. Others dismissed them as ordinary objects dressed in extraordinary claims. Still, the persistence of the evidence mattered. It gave the story a weight beyond mere words. A torn dress could be held. A spinning compass could be seen. A star map could be studied. These tangibles anchored the Hills' testimony, giving believers something to point to when skeptics scoffed. In time, the case drew the attention of author John G. Fuller, who collaborated with the Hills and Dr. Simon to write The Interrupted Journey. Published in 1966, it brought the story to a national audience.
The book included transcripts of the hypnosis sessions, letting readers hear Barney's trembling voice and Betty's calm clarity. For many, it was the first time abduction was presented not as tabloid fodder but as serious testimony. The book was a success, sparking both fascination and controversy. Believers cited it as proof that ordinary people could experience extraordinary contact. Skeptics dissected it as evidence of suggestion, of dreams shaped by culture, of memories made malleable under trance. Yet regardless of stance, few could deny the impact. The Hills story had entered the cultural bloodstream. Films and television followed. In 1975, the made-for-TV movie The UFO Incident dramatized the Hills experience, with James Earl Jones portraying Barney and Estelle Parsons as Betty. For many viewers, this was their first encounter with the idea of alien abduction, and it left a lasting impression. The image of small beings with large eyes, clinical in their examinations, began to take root in the public imagination. The Hills themselves became reluctant symbols. Betty, widowed after Barney's death in 1969, continued to share her story for decades. Barney's voice, however, was forever preserved in those hypnosis transcripts, his fear raw, his words halting, his truth undeniable. Together they became the template for countless accounts that would follow. But in these early years, amid the first swell of attention, the Hills still lived in Portsmouth, still walked their dog, still bought groceries at the same market. Their lives were not consumed by publicity, they were shaped, instead, by the quiet knowledge that their story had become larger than themselves. On evenings when the sky was clear, Betty sometimes took her map outside and compared it to the stars. She did not claim to identify each point. She only looked upward, her pencil marks held against infinity, and wondered. Barney, beside her, often kept his eyes on the ground. For him, the stars no longer held wonder, they held memory too heavy to bear. The evidence, then, was never only in objects or maps. It was in the Hills themselves, the way Betty's conviction never wavered, the way Barney's fear never softened. Evidence lived in their silences, in their glances, in the way one carried curiosity and the other carried dread.
Evidence is a word that promises certainty. In courts, in laboratories, in history books, evidence is meant to anchor truth, to silence doubt. But for Betty and Barney Hill, evidence was never so simple. Their map, their dress, their car, their words under hypnosis, none of it silenced doubt. Each fragment invited interpretation, debate, dismissal. Yet together, those fragments formed the shape of a life forever altered. For Betty, the question of proof mattered less than the question of honesty. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt, what had imprinted itself in her mind like a mark on paper. She offered it openly, without force. "This is what I was shown," she would say. "This is what I remember." Her conviction was not strident, it was quiet, steady, like a candle that did not waver even when winds rose around it. For Barney, the notion of evidence was more painful. Each object tied to that night, the shoes, the watch, the compass, the transcripts, reminded him not only of what had happened, but of the humiliation of being studied. To him, the artifacts were not relics to preserve, but scars that would not heal. He wanted no displays, no arguments, he wanted peace. Yet peace remained elusive. The scientific world, when it turned its gaze to the Hills, found itself split. Some researchers admired the consistency of their testimony, the physical anomalies, the strange congruence of two separate accounts under hypnosis. Others dismissed it outright. Dreams, they argued. Stress, cultural suggestion. The influence of science fiction and Cold War anxieties. Each camp found in the evidence what it expected to see. Dr. Simon himself stood at the uneasy center. His professional reports emphasized caution. Hypnosis reveals memory, but memory does not guarantee objective reality. Yet even he acknowledged the sincerity of the Hills. the depth of their emotion, the congruence of their accounts. He was not prepared to declare the experience literal, but neither could he reduce it to fantasy. The evidence, in his view, was psychological, emotional, human. As the years passed, the map drew more attention. Supporters held it up as the most compelling artifact in abduction history. Skeptics noted the selective nature of the comparisons. The truth lay somewhere between. The map was remarkable, yes, but it was also shaped by the mind, which sees patterns even in clouds. The dress, too, was tested repeatedly. Each new analysis promised clarity, but results remained inconclusive. Stains unexplained, fibers ordinary. The compass trick on the car trunk impressed those who witnessed it, but never yielded laboratory confirmation. Evidence without closure. And yet, perhaps closure was never the point. For the Hills, the evidence was not about convincing the world. It was about carrying their truth together. Betty held to her journals and her map. Barney bore his silence and his memories. Between them lay a story no artifact could fully contain. When the interrupted journey was published, the Hills saw their lives rendered in print. Betty read it with quiet pride, feeling her experiences preserved beyond her own voice. Barney read it with unease, flinching at his own fear on the page. For him, the book was not preservation but exposure. Still, he did not withdraw his consent. He understood that their story, once spoken, belonged not only to them but to history. The world judged as it always does, with curiosity, with ridicule, with fascination. Some found in the Hills the first clear template of alien abduction. Others found in them nothing but dreamers. But the Hills themselves did not need the verdict. They had lived it. In later years, Betty often sat with her map spread across the table, tracing the lines again and again, her finger moving across paper as though retracing a journey. Sometimes she looked up at the night sky and whispered to herself, not with fear, but with wonder. "We are not alone." Barney, meanwhile, carried his truth in silence until his passing in 1969. Friends remembered his dignity, his kindness, his devotion to Betty. They also remembered his weariness, the quiet that never fully left his eyes. For him, the encounter remained wound more than wonder. Yet even in that wound, he remained steadfast beside Betty. He never accused her of fabrication. He never denied her conviction. His truth was simply harder to bear. Evidence, then, was not proof. It was presence. The map, the dress, the compass, the testimonies. Each was a fragment, a whisper, a reminder. None could end the debate. All could deepen the mystery. And so the Hills lived in that in-between, where certainty is impossible, but belief is unavoidable. Their story was not one of proof, but of persistence. A map sketched from memory. A dress kept in a drawer. A pair of voices under hypnosis. One calm, one trembling.
Chapter 6. Legacy and Impact. Stories have lives of their own. Once spoken, once written, once shared, they slip from the hands of their tellers and begin to move through the world. Betty and Barney Hill discovered this truth slowly, as their private memories transformed into a public narrative that shaped how millions of people would imagine contact with the unknown. In the years immediately following their hypnosis sessions, the Hills did not broadcast their story widely. They confided in investigators, corresponded with researchers, and spoke cautiously with trusted friends. For Betty, this felt natural. She wanted the truth to be preserved, not hidden. For Barney, it was more difficult. Each retelling threatened to reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal. Yet their story resonated with those who heard it. UFO groups placed it alongside reports of lights in the sky, radar contacts, and unexplained encounters. But the Hills' account was different. It was intimate. It was not a distant disk above the tree line. It was a craft entered, beings encountered, hours lost. It was missing time made tangible. By 1966, Their story reached a wider audience through John G. Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey. The book presented their case in sober tones, weaving together Betty's journals, Barney's fearful testimony, and Dr. Simon's careful transcripts. Readers were struck not only by the strangeness of the events, but by the ordinariness of the Hills themselves. They were not eccentrics. They were not thrill seekers. They were a postal worker and a social worker from New Hampshire, people whose lives seemed anchored in responsibility and service. The book became a landmark. For believers, it offered a credible foundation for the idea of abduction. For skeptics, it became a text to critique, to dissect, to challenge. But for everyone, it became a reference point, the first widely known narrative of its kind. Before the Hills, UFO reports spoke mostly of sightings. After the Hills, people began to speak of encounters inside the craft, of examinations, of missing hours. The template had been set. The story spread further in 1975 when NBC aired the UFO Incident, a television dramatization of the Hills experience. James Earl Jones portrayed Barney with gravity and vulnerability, while Estelle Parsons gave Betty a quiet intensity. For millions of viewers, this was the first time they imagined the abduction scenario in detail, not as rumor, but as drama played out in living rooms across America. The film etched into public imagination the image of small beings with large eyes, clinical in their curiosity. Betty watched the film with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride that her experience was being acknowledged, unease that it was now beyond her control. Barney did not live to see it. His death in 1969 cut short his struggle with the memories he had never fully embraced. In the years that followed, Betty carried the story alone. Researchers continued to debate the evidence. Some pointed to the star map, to Marjorie Fish's work with three-dimensional models, arguing that Betty's memory had captured a genuine stellar arrangement. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Some examined the dress stains, the compass anomalies, the hypnosis transcripts, and concluded that there was enough to warrant further study. Others insisted it was all dream, suggestion, or cultural influence. But whether believed or dismissed, the Hills story had influence. It gave language to experiences others had long struggled to describe. Soon more people came forward, saying they too had seen strange lights, had lost hours, had dreamed of examinations. Some surely were influenced by what they had read. Others may have been emboldened to speak at last. The pattern of abduction testimony began to emerge: clinical procedures, silent communication, the memory of large, dark eyes. For Betty, this was both burden and purpose. She attended conferences, gave interviews, and corresponded with researchers well into her later years. She was sometimes mocked, sometimes celebrated, but always steady in her conviction. She knew what she had lived. That knowledge could not be taken from her. The legacy of the Hills encounter was not only cultural, but deeply personal. Their marriage had carried the weight of extraordinary experience. Their home had held silence heavier than most could imagine. Together they had borne the first wave of what would become an entire genre of encounters. Their story became the archetype, not because they sought it, but because it would not let them go. When we speak now of abductions, of beings clinical and silent, of star maps and missing hours, we are, knowingly or not, echoing the Hills. Their night in September 1961 became a blueprint for decades of testimony, for countless books, films, and whispered confessions. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty. Once a story enters the public sphere, it takes on a shape of its own, shifting to fit the imagination of those who hear it. For Betty and Barney Hill, their experience began as private memory, fragile and incomplete. But once the interrupted journey and the UFO incident placed it before millions, the narrative moved beyond them. It began to feed the culture of the unexplained. Journalists wrote of the Hills as the first modern abductees.
Researchers cataloged their details, cross-referencing with other cases. Skeptics tested each element against psychology, folklore, and the influence of science fiction. And in the minds of the public, something deeper began to form, the image of the beings themselves. The figures Betty and Barney described were not tall giants or monstrous invaders. They were small, pale, with heads large in proportion, eyes dark and wide. Their movements were clinical, their manner detached, neither violent nor kind. This image became the seed of what would later be called the Gray Alien. Decades later, posters, films, and tabloid headlines would depict wide-eyed beings staring from shadows, but it was in the Hills' testimony that those features first cohered. In the 1960s, the archetype took root gradually. UFO reports prior to the Hills often described humanoids of many shapes, tall, short, clothed in metallic suits, even resembling robots. But the Hills' consistency, recorded under hypnosis and circulated widely, gave the gray form a kind of authority. People who read their story or watched the television dramatization began reporting similar beings. Some surely were influenced by the narrative they had encountered. Others may have recognized their own memories reflected for the first time. Either way, the pattern grew. Media attention amplified the effect. The interrupted journey was reviewed not just in UFO journals, but in mainstream outlets. Some reviewers praised its seriousness, noting how Fuller avoided sensationalism. Others criticized it as uncritical, a too trusting transcription of hypnotic suggestion. But even critical reviews spread the story further. Curiosity grew. The Hills became symbols whether they wanted it or not. Television and radio shows began inviting Betty to speak. After Barney's passing, she became the custodian of the story, carrying it into lecture halls, living rooms, and conferences. She brought the star map, the journals, the compass, her steady conviction. Audiences listened, some in wonder, some in doubt, but always with fascination. The very ordinariness of Betty made the story compelling. She was not a performer. She was a social worker, a widow, a woman who spoke plainly of what she had seen. The cultural context also shaped reception. The early 1960s were years of the space race, of satellites and rockets, of nightly news filled with images of astronauts and orbiting craft. The Cold War had filled skies with suspicion. Any light above might be a missile, a spy plane, or worse. Into this atmosphere, the Hills' account of a craft from beyond Earth resonated powerfully. It tapped into both wonder and fear, the wonder of cosmic possibility, the fear of powers beyond human control. Folklore scholars later traced parallels to older traditions, fairy abductions, night visitations, tales of travelers taken and returned with missing time. The Hills' story, they argued, was a modern retelling of ancient patterns, reshaped in an age of science and spaceflight. Whether or not one accepted this interpretation, the comparison underscored the archetypal power of their experience. It was not only personal, it spoke to something collective. The rise of the gray alien archetype was perhaps the most enduring legacy. Artists began sketching beings with smooth heads and black eyes. Publishers placed them on book covers. Witnesses who came forward in later years often described entities nearly identical to the Hills, a cycle of influence and testimony, impossible to untangle fully. By the late 20th century, the Greys had become cultural shorthand for the alien itself. And yet for Betty, the beings were not symbols, they were memory. She never described them with malice. She spoke of them clinically, almost respectfully, as though they were researchers performing tasks beyond her understanding. Her calmness made the story harder to dismiss. Barney's fear, preserved in the transcripts, gave it emotional gravity. Together their voices formed a balance, curiosity and dread, wonder and violation. The legacy of the Hills was not simply that they were the first abductees, it was that they told their story with honesty, with the weight of people who had nothing to gain and much to lose.
Their lives became case study, archetype, and cautionary tale all at once. By the time the 1970s unfolded, abduction accounts had multiplied. Some were elaborate, filled with elaborate details of journeys through the stars. Others were brief flashes of missing time. But nearly all bore traces of the Hill's blueprint: night roads, sudden lights, clinical procedures, eyes that spoke without words. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty.
By 1966, the Hill's story stepped fully into the national spotlight with the publication of The Interrupted Journey. Written by journalist John G. Fuller, the book wove together their personal accounts, Dr. Simon's hypnosis transcripts, and the context of UFO research at the time. It was sober, deliberate, more documentary than sensational. That restraint was what made it powerful. Readers encountered not just a tale of strange lights and missing hours, but the voices of two ordinary people caught in something extraordinary. They heard Barney's trembling words under trance, his terror raw and unpolished. "They're going to capture us." They heard Betty's calm recounting of examinations, of the star map suspended in memory. The book allowed readers to sit in the room with them, to feel the fear and the wonder without embellishment. The impact was immediate. The Interrupted Journey sold widely, reviewed in both mainstream newspapers and specialized journals. Some critics dismissed it as credulous. Others acknowledged its seriousness, even if they doubted its claims. But regardless of stance, few could deny that the Hills case had become the centerpiece of UFO discourse. No longer confined to letters in small journals or whispered reports at conferences, abduction had entered the American imagination. For Betty, the book was a validation. She felt her memories had been preserved, given form beyond her journals. For Barney, it was more difficult. Reading his own fear in print unsettled him. The exposure of his vulnerability to strangers felt like another invasion. Still, he stood by the story, stood by Betty, understanding that silence would not make the truth vanish. The book also brought them attention from beyond the UFO community. Psychologists debated the case in lectures, citing it as evidence of trauma, suggestion, or cultural influence. Folklorists compared it to older tales of abduction and fairy visitation. Sociologists considered it within the context of an interracial couple navigating America in the 1960s. Their story intersecting with cultural anxieties about identity, authority, and the unknown. Then, in 1975 came the UFO incident, a made-for-television film dramatizing their story. Millions of viewers, many of whom had never read Fuller's book, watched James Earl Jones portray Barney with dignity and fear, and Estelle Parsons portray Betty with quiet conviction. For an entire generation, the Hills experience was not just words on a page, it was images flickering in their living rooms. The film fixed certain details in the public imagination: the lonely New Hampshire road, the hovering disc, the hypnosis sessions where fear broke through in tears. More importantly, it brought the image of the beings themselves into homes across America, small, pale, wide-eyed figures clinical in their actions. For many, this was the first time they saw what an abduction looked like, and once seen, it was hard to forget. The Hills did not seek celebrity, but it arrived anyway. Betty, now alone after Barney's death in 1969, became the primary custodian of their legacy. She spoke at conferences, corresponded with researchers, granted interviews. She remained steady, never wavering in her conviction. Barney's voice remained only in transcripts and recordings, his fear preserved as part of the record. Their story resonated in part because of their ordinariness. They were not performers or mystics, they were a postal worker and a social worker, rooted in everyday life. Their credibility came not from expertise but from sincerity. They did not claim answers, they only reported what had happened to them. American society, caught between Cold War anxiety and space race optimism, was fertile ground for their account. Rockets carried men into orbit, satellites circled Earth.
The possibility of others no longer seemed confined to fiction. The Hills story gave a human face to that possibility. Not distant scientists or military pilots, but ordinary citizens, people like neighbors, like friends, had encountered something beyond. The cultural ripples extended further. Authors cited the Hills in books exploring consciousness, memory, and the unknown. Filmmakers drew from their account when shaping cinematic depictions of contact. By the late 1970s, the Hills story had become part of the architecture of modern folklore. It was referenced not only in UFO circles but in broader cultural conversations about reality, imagination, and belief. Skeptics, too, found in their case a focal point. They argued that Betty's dreams influenced both her own testimony and Barney's under hypnosis. They suggested that cultural influences from Cold War fears to popular media shaped their recollections. But even skeptics acknowledged the sincerity of the Hills. The debate itself ensured the story endured. By the end of the 1970s, the Hills were no longer just witnesses. They were symbols. Symbols of mystery, of belief, of the blurred line between dream and memory. Their legacy was not confined to Portsmouth nor to UFO researchers. It lived in the language people used when they spoke of abductions, in the images artists drew, in the silence people carried when they looked up at the night sky and wondered. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty.
After Barney's death in 1969, Betty carried their story alone. She was widowed at just 41, left with grief, memories, and the responsibility of preserving the account that had defined their lives together. Where Barney had always approached the experience with reluctance, Betty embraced the role of custodian. She continued to write, to speak, to share. For her, silence was never an option. In the 1970s and 1980s, she became a familiar figure at UFO conferences. Audiences often found her soft-spoken, practical, even maternal. She did not embellish, nor did she waver. She simply told the story as she remembered it, offering the star map, her journals, her conviction. For many who had their own unexplained experiences, Betty became a source of reassurance, proof that ordinary people could face the extraordinary and survive with dignity. Her correspondence grew into thousands of letters. She responded patiently, offering advice, encouragement, and in some cases, solace. She became not only a witness, but a confidant for others who believed they had seen or experienced similar events. Through Betty, the private became communal. The Hills story was no longer one family's burden. It had become part of a growing network of testimonies. At times, Betty ventured into more speculative territory, reporting further sightings and experiences throughout her life. Skeptics seized upon these later claims, suggesting that her openness made her less credible, that she saw patterns where none existed. But to her supporters, Betty's continued encounters reinforced her authenticity. She had not abandoned her truth, even when ridiculed. She carried it until the end. The cultural legacy of the Hills story deepened across those decades. Their account was cited in countless books, documentaries, and academic papers. Psychologists studied their case as an example of trauma and memory. Folklorists saw it as a modern myth with ancient roots. Science fiction creators borrowed liberally from the imagery, curved rooms, silent beings, large black eyes that had emerged from their sessions. By the 1990s, the gray alien archetype was so familiar it appeared on t-shirts, posters, and bumper stickers. Hollywood films depicted beings nearly identical to those Betty and Barney described. The language of missing time, abduction, and examination had become cultural shorthand, recognizable even to those who had never heard the Hills' names. The story they had lived had become part of the shared imagination of humanity. For Betty, this transformation was bittersweet. She wanted their truth to be remembered, but she sometimes lamented the way popular culture simplified it into caricature. She stressed that the beings she encountered were not monsters, not villains. They were scientists, explorers, curious, clinical,
detached. For her, the story was not one of horror but of contact, however unsettling. Researchers continued to examine the evidence. The star map remained the most discussed artifact. Marjorie Fish's interpretation linking it to Zeta Reticuli was debated for decades. Some astronomers dismissed it as coincidence. Others argued the alignment was too close to ignore. For Betty, the debate mattered less than the conviction. She knew what she had seen, and she would not surrender that memory. The dress, preserved carefully, also drew attention. In later years, it was tested for unusual substances. Some results suggested anomalies in the fabric, though nothing conclusive enough to convince skeptics. Still, the dress remained a symbol, an object that had lived through the night of September 19, 1961, carrying its quiet stains into history. Betty lived until 2004, nearly half a century after the encounter. In those years, she became both a symbol and a lightning rod. Believers celebrated her courage. Skeptics questioned her motives, yet through all of it, she never wavered. Her voice, soft and steady, repeated the same truth again and again. This is what happened to us. This is what I remember. The impact of the Hills story cannot be measured only in evidence or belief. It must also be measured in influence. Their account gave shape to modern abduction lore. It offered language to those who felt silenced by their own experiences. It reshaped popular culture, planting images that endure in film, literature, and art. It even altered the way society talks about memory, trauma, and the unknown. For all the debate, one fact remains: the Hills were the first to bring abduction into the modern era of UFO discourse. Before them, encounters were distant lights in the sky. After them, encounters became intimate, personal, unsettlingly close. They were the threshold, the hinge on which the phenomenon turned. On her porch in later years, Betty sometimes sat with neighbors and pointed out constellations, speaking of the vastness above. She did not argue with skeptics. She did not demand belief. She simply shared what she knew, and when she traced her finger across the stars, following the lines of her remembered map, she carried with her both Barney's fear and her own wonder. The legacy of the Hills is not proof, it is presence. It is the story of two people on a lonely road, of missing hours, of eyes that reflected them back to themselves. It is the silence that followed, the courage it took to speak, the way that speech changed the world. The silence lingered. The sky was not empty.
Chapter 7. Reflections on Memory and Belief. Memory is both anchor and tide. It holds us steady in the stories of our lives, yet it drifts, reshapes, and returns altered by time. For Betty and Barney Hill, memory was never simply recall, it was a battleground. They lived with hours erased, then restored under hypnosis, and carried the burden of knowing those memories would be questioned, doubted, dissected. Their story invites us to consider not only what happened to them, but what it means to remember it all. In the stillness of Dr. Simon's office, under the cadence of breath and count, memory unfolded like a long locked drawer opening. Betty's recollections came with calm detail: the star map, the examinations, the leader's quiet authority. Barney's came with trembling fear, the paralysis, the overwhelming eyes, the sense of exposure. Two people, recalling the same event, yet experiencing it through different lenses of emotion. What does this say about memory? That it is not only about facts, but about feeling. The same moment can be wonder to one, and terror to another. The same silence can soothe and suffocate. Memory is not an impartial recorder. It is a participant, shaping the story even as it preserves it. Skeptics remind us that memory can be malleable. Dreams, suggestion, and culture all leave fingerprints upon it. Betty had read books on UFOs before the hypnosis sessions, they point out. Barney carried stress and health issues that may have colored his recall. Hypnosis itself, they argue, can lead to confabulation, where imagination hardens into recollection. Yet to dismiss memory entirely is to overlook its power. For the Hills, these recollections were not idle fantasies. They carried weight, so much that Barney wept under trance, so much that Betty drew maps with precision, so much that their lives bent beneath the gravity of those hours. Memory, whether literal truth or inner truth, shaped their reality. Belief is the companion to memory, sometimes its shield, sometimes its burden. For Betty, belief gave her strength. She trusted what she remembered, not because it was easy, but because it was undeniable. She believed not only in her own testimony, but in the possibility that humanity was not alone. That belief sustained her through ridicule, through decades of scrutiny. For Barney, belief was heavier. To believe meant to accept that his autonomy had been taken, that he had been studied by beings he could not understand. His belief was not comfort, but injury. He carried it like a scar, yet even he could not deny it outright. He did not accuse Betty of invention. He did not retreat into denial. He bore the belief quietly, painfully, until his death. The Hills story reminds us that belief is not simply about proof. It is about how we live with the unexplainable. Some find in it reassurance, others violation, others only mystery. Belief is shaped as much by who we are as by what we experience. For society, their story forced a confrontation with the fragility of both memory and belief. Could hypnosis uncover truth? Could dreams conceal reality? Could two ordinary people, without motive for deception, carry testimony that challenged our understanding of the universe? The Hills made these questions unavoidable, and so their legacy extends beyond UFO lore. It touches psychology, folklore, culture. It invites reflection on how humans carry extraordinary experiences, whether as myth, as trauma, or as revelation. It asks us to hold space for testimony that cannot be proven, yet cannot be ignored. At night, when we lie down and let consciousness drift, memory loosens its grip. Dreams mingle with fragments of the day. Stories resurface, altered by imagination. Perhaps this is why the Hills account resonates as a sleep story. It dwells in that liminal space where memory and dream overlap, where certainty softens and possibility expands. To witness is one thing. To speak of what you have witnessed is another. Between the two lies a gulf of risk of disbelief, of ridicule, of carrying a truth others cannot bear to hear. For Betty and Barney Hill, the act of testimony was as significant as the memories themselves. Their experience might have remained locked away, a private silence shared only between them, but silence has weight, and they could not carry it alone. Betty reached outward, writing letters, sending sketches, seeking context. Barney followed more reluctantly, yet even he chose honesty over denial in Dr. Simon's office. In that choice, they became witnesses, not only to their own lives, but to something larger. The burden of testimony is often heavier than the burden of experience. To endure something inexplicable is isolating, but to speak it aloud is to invite judgment. The Hills bore that judgment with differing spirits. Betty, fortified by conviction, endured the doubts with steady resolve. Barney, more vulnerable, felt the sting of scrutiny deeply, yet both stood by their story. They did not recant, they did not twist their words for favor, they simply endured. Society, confronted with such testimony, faced its own burden, what to do with it. For some, the Hills became a beacon, proof that ordinary people could encounter the extraordinary. For others, they were symbols of delusion, a cautionary tale about suggestion and dream. But whether embraced or dismissed, their story demanded attention. It seeded conversations in homes, classrooms, and laboratories. It asked questions science could not yet answer. The act of testimony transformed their private memory into public imagination. Once published, once televised, their story became part of a shared cultural landscape. Others who had hesitated to speak began to find their voices. Reports of missing time increased. Stories of examinations multiplied. The Hills had drawn the outline of a pattern, and others began to color it in. This is the power of narrative. It shapes not only what is believed, but what can be believed. Before the hills, abduction was not a recognized category of experience. After them, it became a framework into which countless stories could fit. Their testimony, given in steady words and trembling voices, became the architecture of a new folklore. And like all folklore, it carried both weight and fluidity. The details shifted in retellings. Some emphasized Betty's map, others Barney's fear. Some saw in it proof of extraterrestrials, others the fragility of memory, yet at its core remained two people, alone on a night road, who encountered something that changed them. That simplicity gave the story its endurance. For Betty and Barney themselves, the burden was deeply personal. Betty's belief sustained her, but also isolated her. She lived much of her life as a symbol, carrying her truth into spaces where few would understand. Barney's burden was even heavier. His fear was not easily shared. It became part of his health, his weariness, his silences. In both, testimony was not liberation, but responsibility. And yet, they gave their testimony anyway. That courage is often overlooked. It is easy, decades later, to treat their story as a case study, a folklore entry, a cultural reference. But in the moment, for the hills, it was an act of vulnerability. They exposed themselves to doubt in order to remain true to their memory. In the collective imagination, the hills' testimony opened doors. It invited us to reflect on the limits of certainty, on the possibility of realities beyond our grasp. It asked us to consider that memory, fragile though it is, can carry truths too heavy to ignore. And it reminded us that belief is not always about proof. It is about what we choose to carry in the face of mystery. Memory is never isolated. It is born inside a culture, clothed in the symbols available at the time. When the hills recalled beings small and pale with wide eyes, they did so in a world already steeped in the imagery of the space age, the Cold War, the looming unknown. Their testimony was both personal and collective, a private experience rendered through the language their era could understand. This does not lessen it. If anything, it makes it more profound. For memory is not only about what happened, but about how we make sense of what happened. When ancient shepherds saw lights in the sky, they spoke of gods and chariots. When medieval villagers felt pressure on their chest in the night, they spoke of witches or demons. When Betty and Barney drove through the White Mountains in 1961, they spoke of a craft and beings from beyond the stars. The forms change, but the essence is constant. Human beings seek meaning in mystery. We shape what we do not understand into stories, and those stories shape us in return. Belief too lives inside culture. To believe Betty and Barney is not only to trust them, but to accept the possibility that the universe is inhabited, that others can cross the gulf of space to reach us. For some, this belief is wondrous. For others, it is terrifying. For many, it is too disruptive to hold. Belief then is not only about the hills, it is about what we are willing to allow into our picture of reality. Folklorists see in the hills account the bones of older myths. The missing time recalls tales of people lured into fairy rings, who return to find hours or years gone. The medical examinations echo old stories of initiations, where the body is tested, marked, transformed. The star map mirrors ancient cosmologies, where travelers were shown charts of the heavens by gods or spirits. Even the contrast between Betty's curiosity and Barney's fear mirrors older archetypes, the seeker and the reluctant, the one who embraces mystery and the one who resists it. Yet to call it myth does not mean it is untrue. Myths are not lies. They are vessels for truths too large for simple explanation. The Hills' story may be myth in structure, but that does not diminish its reality to them. It may, in fact, be what gives it resonance, because their private experience echoes patterns humanity has carried for centuries. Memory and myth intersect in ways that defy easy separation. Perhaps Betty truly saw a star map projected in the air. Perhaps her mind, reaching for meaning, shaped her dream into one. Either way, the image endures because it speaks to the human need for direction, for origin, for place. Perhaps Barney truly felt eyes searching him beyond the physical. Perhaps his fear gave form to the silence he could not explain. Either way, the terror endures because it speaks to the human fear of being known too deeply. The Hills' testimony then belongs to them, but also to us. It is theirs in detail, ours in resonance. Their memory shapes our folklore in turn shapes how their memory is remembered. This cycle is not corruption, it is life. Stories breathe by being retold, reinterpreted, reimagined, and so we must approach their case with humility. We cannot demand certainty because certainty is not available. But we can honor what their story reveals, that human beings, when faced with mystery, reach for meaning. That memory, however fragile, can carry weight enough to alter a culture. That belief is not simply about fact, but about courage, the courage to speak, to endure doubt, to stand by one's truth. For Betty, memory became mission. For Barney, it became wound. For both, it became legacy. And for us, it became a mirror, reflecting the oldest human impulse to tell stories that help us live with the unknown. When we speak of memory and belief, we are also speaking of ourselves. The Hills' story is extraordinary, but at its heart lies something deeply human, the struggle to live with experiences that do not fit easily into the frame of the ordinary. Each of us carries such moments, even if they are less dramatic, dreams that felt more real than waking, nights when time slipped strangely, silences that seemed to whisper with presence. Betty and Barney's testimony invites us to sit with those moments, not to explain them away, but to allow them space. Their memories may be debated endlessly by scientists, skeptics, and storytellers, yet beyond the debate remains the simple fact that two people lived with something they could not forget. That truth alone makes their story worthy of reflection. Memory can comfort, and it can wound. For Betty, memory was a lantern, guiding her through ridicule, giving her a sense of connection to something vast. For Barney, memory was a weight, pressing against his spirit, shaping his health, narrowing his laughter, and yet both remembered. Neither turned away. Memory may be fragile, but it is also stubborn. It stays when it chooses, and it insists on being heard. Belief, too, is not uniform. Some find in the Hills' story a reason to look at the night sky with wonder, imagining neighbors among the stars. Others find in it a reminder of vulnerability, of the possibility that we are not as sovereign as we believe. Still others find only mystery, unwilling to believe or disbelieve, content to let the story exist as a question. Each posture is valid, for belief is not a single path. It is a landscape we each walk in our own way. In a broader sense, the Hills' story offers something rare, a chance to reflect on how we live with the unknown. Most of life encourages us to define, to categorize, to explain, but mystery resists those impulses. It asks us to dwell in silence, to accept not knowing, to breathe into the space where certainty does not reach. That is difficult, and yet it is also calming, because in not knowing lies possibility. Perhaps that is why the Hills' testimony works as a sleep story. It mirrors the very process of drifting into dreams. As we close our eyes, we leave behind certainty, enter into the realm of images, fragments, whispers. We recall and we forget at once. We believe and we doubt in the same breath. Memory and dream blur, just as they did for Betty and Barney on that long night drive. And so their story becomes more than a historical case. It becomes a meditation, a reminder that memory is never final, belief is never simple, and mystery is never gone. It lingers in silence, in sky, in us. Imagine yourself now, as they once were, on a quiet road beneath a canopy of stars. The tires hum. The radio fades in and out. The night air is cool, carrying the scent of pine. You look upward. The stars are steady, ancient, familiar. Yet among them, perhaps, is a light that does not hold still. A light that moves, that follows, that invites. You do not need to know what it is. You only need to feel the wonder of its presence. This is the gift of their story, not proof, not certainty, but wonder. Wonder that stretches beyond fear, beyond skepticism, into something gentler. Wonder that allows you to breathe deeper, to rest easier, to dream without boundaries. Chapter 8. Wider Ripples. A single story can be like a stone dropped into still water. Its ripples spread outward, touching distant shores long after the stone itself has sunk from view. The Hills story, whispered at first, then written, then dramatized on television, became such a stone. What began as one couple's memory on a lonely New Hampshire road grew into a pattern recognized around the world. In the years following the interrupted journey and the UFO incident, reports of abductions multiplied. Some were brief flashes, an hour unaccounted for, a dream too vivid to dismiss. Others mirrored the Hills in uncanny detail, lights that followed cars, missing time, beings clinical in their silence. Many who came forward admitted they had been reluctant to speak until they heard of the Hills. Their testimony gave language to the ineffable. It made silence less absolute. UFO research groups began to categorize abduction as a phenomenon distinct from sightings. Where earlier decades had focused on disks in the sky or radar anomalies, now investigators found themselves listening to personal narratives of contact. The Hills case became the reference point, the framework against which all others were compared. Researchers asked, was there missing time? Were there medical procedures? Were there beings with large, dark eyes? Each detail carried the imprint of the Hills night in 1961. For some, this pattern was proof of consistency, that people across time and space described the same experience. For skeptics, it was proof of influence, that once the Hills story spread, others unconsciously borrowed its structure. Either way, the Hills had drawn the outline of a myth that others would inhabit. Even the language of missing time gained traction through their case. Before them, witnesses often described confusion, hours gone, watches stopped. After them, the phrase became almost clinical, shorthand for a shared human puzzle. To say one had missing time was to invoke the Hills without naming them. Their story had become a lens through which others understood their own. The ripple extended beyond individuals to institutions. Psychologists cited the Hills in discussions of trauma, suggestion, and memory. Folklorists drew parallels to centuries-old tales of being led away by otherworldly beings. Sociologists examined the case in the context of race, noting that an interracial couple in 1961 carried burdens of social scrutiny that may have shaped both their experience and its reception. Each discipline found in the Hills a touchstone for its own questions. And then there were the whispers of the men in black. Some who came forward after the Hills spoke of strange visitors in dark suits, warning them to keep quiet. Though the Hills themselves did not emphasize such encounters, their case opened a door that others stepped through. The narrative of silence enforced by mysterious figures grew alongside the narrative of abduction, intertwining into a folklore of secrecy. Betty, still living in Portsmouth, became a point of contact for many. Letters arrived from strangers who had seen lights, lost hours, dreamed of examinations. She responded with patience, offering reassurance, sometimes connecting them with researchers. For those who felt alone in their experiences, Betty's presence was a balm. Her story had opened a space where others could speak. Barney's absence after 1969 gave the story a different texture. Without his balancing fear and skepticism, the narrative leaned more toward Betty's conviction. She carried it steadily, but the loss of Barney's voice meant that one half of the original testimony was forever silent. Even so, his recorded words, trembling under hypnosis, continued to echo. His fear lent gravity to Betty's certainty. Together, even after his death, their voices remained entwined. The ripples did not stop at America's shores. Across Europe, Australia, South America, reports emerged with striking similarities.
Couples on night roads, families in rural homes, lone travelers, all began speaking of lights, silence, missing time. Some surely drew from the Hills case, others may have carried memories long buried, finally emboldened to surface. The global spread ensured that their story was not seen as isolated, but as part of a wider, stranger tapestry. Popular culture, too, absorbed the ripples. Novels borrowed their imagery. Films drew from their structure. Television shows portrayed abductions with scenes lifted almost directly from their sessions. By the 1980s, the motif of the gray alien with dark, oval eyes was so embedded in public imagination that it appeared on posters, stickers, toys. Few who saw those images knew the Hills by name, but the lineage traced back to them. And yet, for all the cultural echoes, the Hills' story remained personal. Betty continued to share with the same steady tone, reminding audiences that what mattered most was not speculation, but testimony. She often said she did not seek to convince skeptics. She only wished to preserve what she remembered. That humility, paradoxically, made her more convincing. She asked for no belief, only for listening. The ripples of their story remind us that mystery is never solitary. One voice becomes many, one memory becomes a map for others. The Hills' night in 1961 became not only their burden but a shared point of reflection for a generation seeking meaning in the stars.
By the 1970s, the Hills' story was no longer a singular anomaly. It had become the framework through which countless others interpreted their own strange experiences. The themes first voiced in Betty's calm testimony, and Barney's trembling fear began to echo in reports from every corner of the world. In the United States, investigators documented a rise in abduction accounts. Some came from couples on highways, describing lights that followed them, watches that stopped, hours that vanished. Others came from solitary witnesses, farmers, students, office workers, who spoke of waking in the night to find their rooms filled with light, of losing consciousness and waking hours later with no explanation. The vocabulary was now familiar: missing time, examinations, beings with large, dark eyes. The Hills had given language to what once lay unspeakable. As these reports accumulated, researchers began to categorize common elements. There was often an initial light in the sky, dismissed at first as an aircraft or star. There was often a moment of paralysis, a sense of being led rather than dragged. There were medical-like procedures, skin samples, eye examinations, instruments placed against the body. And always, there were the eyes, large, dark, impossible to ignore. These patterns were not identical in every case, but the resonance with the Hills was undeniable. Skeptics argued that this resonance was precisely the problem. They claimed that once the Hills account became public, it shaped the expectations of others. People who dreamed vividly or experienced sleep paralysis might unconsciously mold their experiences into the structure already circulating in books and films. Psychologists suggested that abduction narratives were modern myths, stories told in the language of space-age anxiety, reinforced by cultural repetition. Believers countered that the very consistency of the reports was evidence of shared reality. How could so many unrelated people, across countries and continents, describe the same procedures, the same beings, unless there was something real behind it? The debate itself grew heated, each side citing the Hills as either origin or proof. Betty, still living in Portsmouth, watched this evolution with interest. She corresponded with many who claimed their own encounters, offering compassion more than analysis. To her, it mattered less whether every account was genuine than that people felt heard. She believed her own story without hesitation, but she also understood that experiences of the extraordinary often came tangled with dream, fear, and imagination. She did not demand uniformity. She only asked that testimony be taken seriously. Meanwhile, the Men in Black motif gained strength. Though not central to the Hills case, later abductees often reported visits from enigmatic figures warning them to remain silent. Some wore suits and hats, others seemed less human. The idea of secrecy, of enforced silence, became entwined with abduction lore. It resonated with the cultural mood of the time, an era of government mistrust, covert programs, and revelations of hidden surveillance. The Hills case had opened a door, and others walked through it carrying darker echoes. The 1980s brought further expansion. Authors like Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber published accounts that reached wide audiences, amplifying abduction narratives. Their books described experiences in vivid detail, often echoing the template first drawn by the Hills: the light in the sky, the missing hours, the examinations, the beings clinical in their curiosity. These works solidified the image of the gray alien as cultural icon. By then, the archetype was so strong that it appeared on t-shirts, posters, and film screens. Skeptics pointed again to influence. They argued that once the Hills narrative entered culture, it became a script that others unconsciously followed. Believers pointed instead to convergence, that across decades and continents, the same themes arose too consistently to dismiss. In both views, the Hills remained the origin point. Either they were the first to invent the story that others copied, or they were the first to publicly reveal a reality shared by many. What cannot be denied is the emotional authenticity of the Hills themselves. Betty's conviction and Barney's terror continue to resonate because they feel lived, not crafted. That authenticity gave permission to others to speak, even if their stories were messy or fragmented. In that sense, the Hills' legacy is not only about abduction. It is about the courage to give voice to the unspeakable. And so, by the close of the 1980s, the Hills' ripples had spread into a vast sea of testimony. Some reports would later be discredited, others would remain unexplained. But the pattern, the lonely road, the silent beings, the lost hours, endured. It endured because it was anchored in the memory of two people who on a September night in 1961 encountered something they could never forget. The ripples of the Hills' story did not stop at the borders of New Hampshire, nor even at the edges of the United States. As the decades unfolded, echoes of their experience surfaced across the globe. In villages, cities, and remote countrysides, people began to speak of encounters that bore striking similarities, stories that seemed to belong not to one culture, but to the human condition itself. In South America, reports of abductions grew through the 1970s and 1980s. Farmers in Brazil described being taken from fields beneath strange lights, waking hours later with burns on their skin or unaccountable marks. In Argentina, couples on rural roads told of being stopped by discs that descended silently, their vehicles failing, their memories fractured. These stories often carried local texture, references to landscapes, to traditions, to cultural fears, but the structure remained familiar: light, paralysis, missing time, beings clinical in their curiosity. Europe too began to echo the pattern. In the United Kingdom, witnesses described cars stalling on country lanes as luminous objects hovered overhead. In France, families spoke of bright spheres that descended into fields, leaving behind scorched grass and silence. In Italy and Spain, accounts of encounters grew, some simple sightings, others full abductions. Many of these witnesses had never read The Interrupted Journey or seen the UFO incident. And yet, their memories followed lines the Hills had first traced. Skeptics argued that even without direct exposure, the Hills narrative had become part of the cultural ether. News reports, magazines, documentaries, all carried fragments of their story. A farmer in South America or a driver in rural France might have absorbed the imagery indirectly, shaping their own experiences into the mold already present in global discourse. To them, the echoes were proof of cultural contagion, but believers countered that the very distance of these echoes made them more powerful. How could a farmer in Brazil, a lorry driver in the north of England, and a housewife in rural Spain all describe similar procedures, similar beings, similar missing hours, unless there was something universal behind it?
The hills in this view had not created a pattern. They had simply been the first to give it voice. In Australia, stories of taken times surfaced, often among travelers crossing empty stretches of road at night. Drivers described headlights flickering, then failing, a bright light descending, a sudden awareness of being watched. Hours later, they would find themselves farther down the road, disoriented, with watches stopped or reset. The parallels to the hills' long drive through New Hampshire were undeniable. Africa, and Asia too, produced accounts. Though less documented, reports emerged of lights, paralysis, and intrusive examinations. Cultural differences shaped the details. Sometimes the beings were described in more spiritual terms, sometimes the craft less metallic, more luminous. Yet the core remained. Something had interrupted lives, left memories fractured, created silence where hours should have been. For Betty, who corresponded with witnesses far beyond her own country, these international echoes were affirming. She often said she did not see her experience as isolated. She believed that what she and Barney endured was part of something larger, something not bound by geography. Each new testimony from abroad felt like another thread in a vast invisible web. Barney, had he lived to see it, might have felt differently. For him, each repetition of the pattern would have been a reopening of the wound. He struggled enough with his own memories. To hear them mirrored across continents might have deepened his fear rather than eased it. His absence meant that Betty carried the story outward alone, shaping its reception on the global stage. Researchers, too, were divided. Some argued that the spread of abduction accounts worldwide proved cultural influence. Just as stories of saints or apparitions spread through medieval Europe, so too did UFO narratives spread in the modern age. Others saw in the global resonance a deeper truth, that something was genuinely occurring across cultures, and the hills had simply been the first to endure it in a way that captured attention. Regardless of interpretation, the international echoes ensured that the hills' story was not dismissed as parochial. It was not merely the tale of one couple in New Hampshire. It had become a global archetype, a lens through which people everywhere understood their own inexplicable nights. The ripples widened further through popular culture. Films from Japan to Brazil borrowed imagery of small pale beings with dark eyes. Comic books in Europe depicted abductions eerily close to Betty's hypnosis accounts. Folk tales in Africa began to weave in images of flying discs alongside older traditions. The hills' memory had crossed oceans, embedding itself into the shared imagination of humanity. And yet, for all the spread, the essence remained personal. Each witness, whether in New England or Argentina, spoke of silence, of time that slipped, of fear and wonder that lingered. Each story was its own, even as it echoed others.
By the late 20th century, the ripples from the hills' night drive had grown into something more than scattered waves. They had merged into a current, a mythology that carried with it countless voices, each echoing the same patterns of light, silence, and missing hours. What began as one couple's private ordeal had become part of the architecture of modern folklore. The features first etched into memory by Betty and Barney, the silent craft, the beings with large eyes, the examinations, the map of stars, were now repeated so often that they seemed timeless. For some, this repetition was evidence of influence. Once the story spread, others naturally followed its shape. For others, the consistency was evidence of truth. The hills had revealed something real, and others across the world had encountered the same. In either view, the hills case was the foundation stone. Later abduction narratives, whether from New England or New South Wales, whether in English or Portuguese, drew upon their template. Even when details varied, the resonance remained. A light that follows, a gap in memory. The clinical silence of beings who do not speak aloud. The echo of Barney's trembling voice under hypnosis. The calm certainty of Betty's hand drawing lines between stars. As the decades passed, researchers began to write of abduction not as isolated cases but as a phenomenon. They cited patterns, compiled similarities, built taxonomies of experience. The Hills account was always at the beginning of those lists. Without their testimony, the category itself might never have taken form. Sociologists saw in the spread of abduction lore a reflection of cultural anxiety, the Cold War, the space race, the expansion of technology beyond human control. Psychologists saw in it the workings of dream, trauma, and suggestion, amplified by media. Folklorists saw the rebirth of ancient motifs, night visitors, stolen time, beings neither divine nor human. Each discipline found in the Hills' story not only testimony but symbol. Yet for Betty and Barney, and for those who followed them, the experience was never symbol, it was lived. It was night air cold through the car window, headlights fading in the presence of a brighter light, the shock of finding oneself miles farther down the road with no memory of how. It was terror in Barney's eyes, it was conviction in Betty's sketches, it was silence heavy enough to bend the rest of their lives around it. The permanence of their story lies in that duality. It is both myth and memory, both pattern and personal wound. To the culture it became an archetype. To the Hills it remained a night that would not end. By the end of the 20th century, when people spoke of abduction, they were speaking, knowingly or not, in the language the Hills had given them. The small beings with large eyes, the examinations, the map of stars, all were part of a collective imagination that traced back to a lonely stretch of Route 3 in 1961. And so the ripples became a tide, carrying the Hills' story forward into future generations. It entered books, films, art. It entered the quiet confessions of those who woke from dreams too vivid to dismiss. It entered the way people looked at the night sky, no longer only with wonder, but also with the question, who else is out there? In the end, the Hills' legacy is not only in what they remembered, but in what they allowed others to remember. They gave voice to silence. They turned private bewilderment into shared mythology. They made it possible to speak of the unspeakable, to carry the burden of missing time, not alone but together. Chapter 9. Closing Reflections. As the years rolled forward, the story of Betty and Barney Hill settled into something larger than either of them could have imagined. What began as a drive through the White Mountains on a September night had become part of the way the world thought about the unknown. Their journey was no longer only theirs. It was a mirror, reflecting questions every person carries when they look into the night sky. The Hills never claimed to have all the answers. They did not present their memories as proof, only as testimony. Betty spoke softly of her encounters, offering the star map, the details of the examination, the presence of beings who seemed more curious than cruel. Barney, with trembling voice, described the terror of eyes too vast, too silent to endure. Together their voices formed a balance, wonder and fear, conviction and vulnerability. Over time, those voices were joined by many others. People from around the world spoke of lights, of lost hours, of beings clinical in their intent. Each new story echoed the Hills, yet each was also its own. The collective chorus became larger than any single account. And still, at the center, the Hills remained, the first to break the silence. What their story reminds us is that mystery is not an interruption of life, but a part of it. To live is to encounter moments we cannot explain, moments that shake the certainty of our routines. For most, these mysteries are small, a dream too vivid, a coincidence too sharp, a silence that feels full of presence. For the Hills, the mystery was vast, stretching into the stars. Yet their response was the same as ours must be: to live with what cannot be explained, to carry it gently, to let it shape without consuming. The cultural impact of their testimony is easy to measure in books, films, archetypes, but the deeper impact is quieter. It lives in the way people learned to listen to one another, to treat strange experiences not only with skepticism but also with compassion. It lives in the courage of witnesses who, inspired by Betty and Barney, dared to speak of what they had seen. It lives in the reminder that the unknown belongs not only to experts and authorities, but also to ordinary people driving home on dark roads. For Betty, the journey after Barney's death was one of endurance. She carried the story into decades he did not live to see. She listened to others, offered solace, and never wavered in her belief. For Barney, the journey ended sooner, his life cut short by illness, his voice preserved in the transcripts of Dr. Simon's sessions. Yet even in absence, his presence endured, his fear grounding Betty's wonder, his vulnerability balancing her strength. Together they gave us more than an abduction account. They gave us a meditation on memory and belief. They showed us how two people can endure the same night and carry it in utterly different ways. They taught us that truth is not always about agreement, but about the courage to live with contradiction. And as we reflect on their story, we are invited to reflect on our own. Each of us has mysteries that linger, questions that resist resolution. Each of us carries memories that do not fit neatly into the order of our days. To sit with those mysteries as the Hills did, is to accept that life is not only about what is known. It is also about what waits just beyond knowing. So imagine once again the long road through the White Mountains, the sky dark and quiet, stars scattered in their ancient constellations. A car moving steadily southward, two people inside, carrying with them love, routine, and the unremarkable hopes of returning home. Then a light appears, it shifts, it follows, hours vanish. A story begins. From that night, ripples spread through their lives, through culture, through the way we imagine our place in the cosmos. And still the road remains. Still the stars shine above. Still mystery waits at the edge of vision. Memory is not only what we carry for ourselves, it is what we leave for others. Betty and Barney's memories became part of the inheritance of an entire culture woven into the way we think about mystery. Their story is preserved not just in books or films, but in the quiet way people whisper of strange nights, of missing time, of stars that feel too close. For Betty, memory was an act of sharing. She wrote letters, gave talks, responded to strangers who sought her advice. Her map, her journals, her steady voice, all were ways of placing her memory into the hands of others. In doing so, she transformed her private experience into a public gift. She gave language to silence, allowing others to speak their own truths. For Barney, memory was heavier, quieter, more private. He did not carry it outward into the world, but inward, into his body, his health, his silences. His testimony under hypnosis, trembling and reluctant, was his legacy. In those sessions he revealed the cost of living with the inexplicable. His fear, preserved in transcripts, remains as important as Betty's certainty. Together their memories form a whole: wonder and dread, curiosity and violation. What we inherit from them is not proof, but courage. The courage to speak of what cannot be explained. The courage to live with contradiction. The courage to endure doubt without abandoning truth. Their story reminds us that bravery is not always found in conquest or discovery. Sometimes it is found in simply standing by one's memory, even when the world refuses to believe. The Hills also leave us a meditation on how belief shapes us. Betty's belief gave her strength, a sense of connection to a larger cosmos. Barney's reluctant belief weighed upon him, a reminder of vulnerability and exposure. Both forms of belief are real. Both reveal how deeply mystery can alter the course of a life. To encounter the unknown is to be changed, but the direction of that change depends on the heart that carries it. In reflecting on their journey, we are invited to reflect on our own. What memories do we carry that defy easy explanation? What experiences linger in silence because we fear others will not understand? To live fully is to accept that not all of life fits neatly into categories. Some of it remains beyond, shimmering at the edge of comprehension, waiting to be honored rather than solved. The hills remind us too of the intimacy of mystery. Their story is cosmic, lights in the sky, maps of stars, beings from beyond. Yet it is also deeply human. Two people in a car, a marriage tested by silence, the quiet strength of love that endured even when understanding could not. Their story is both vast and tender, both infinite and domestic. It reminds us that the unknown often arrives not in distant galaxies, but on the roads we travel every day. Imagine the scene once more, the car headlights illuminating a ribbon of asphalt, the steady hum of tires, the radio fading in and out. Two people leaning toward one another, watching the same light shift across the sky. Their hearts beat faster, their hands tighten. They do not yet know what is coming, only that the night has changed. In that moment, they are like all of us, ordinary lives touched by extraordinary silence. What they left us is not only their story, but an invitation to wonder, an invitation to listen to those who carry strange memories, an invitation to look up at the stars with humility, recognizing both our smallness and our possibility. Their courage continues to ripple outward. Each time their story is told, another person feels less alone in their own unexplainable night. Each time their names are spoken, memory itself is honored, not only theirs, but the countless others who remain silent. The hills teach us that memory, even when fractured, is worth preserving. That belief, even when doubted, is worth carrying, and that mystery, even when unanswered, is worth holding close. As the hills' story rippled outward, it became more than history, more than folklore. It became a meditation on what it means to be human in a universe that will always be larger than our comprehension. Their testimony was not only about beings and craft, it was about how we live with the unexplainable. Betty and Barney remind us that the unknown does not arrive with warning. It interrupts ordinary nights, simple drives, quiet routines. It asks us to carry what does not fit into reason. In this way, their story is not so different from our own. Each of us has moments that defy explanation, dreams that cling after waking, silences that feel alive, coincidences that seem too sharp to ignore. These moments may not involve lights in the sky, but they ask the same thing of us: humility, patience, courage, memory, and belief intertwine here. The hills remembered differently, Betty with curiosity, Barney with fear, yet both remembered enough to know their lives had been altered. This duality is what gives their story power. It is not polished into one voice, one certainty. It is fractured, human, real. In their contrast, we see the truth that the unknown does not arrive the same way for everyone. It bends itself through the lens of each heart, and what of us, listening decades later? We carry their memory not as proof, but as parable. Their courage becomes our reminder to speak softly of our own mysteries. Their silence becomes our invitation to listen when others share theirs. Their gaze at the night sky becomes our own, filled not only with wonder but with humility. The hills' journey also teaches us about companionship. They faced something unfathomable, but they faced it together. In the car, on the road, in the sessions with Dr. Simon, their voices intertwined, one afraid, one steady, one trembling, one resolute. Their differences did not divide them. They carried the burden as partners. Even after Barney's passing, Betty carried it for both of them. Their love was, in its own way, a kind of evidence that even in the face of the incomprehensible, human connection endures. There is comfort in remembering that, for if the universe is vast, if its mysteries are infinite, still we are not alone. We carry one another through the dark, just as the hills did. We hold hands when silence deepens. We share stories when the stars feel too close. This is how humanity has always endured mystery together. Imagine now the vastness of the sky above them, the stars scattered endlessly, ancient light traveling through space to reach their eyes.
Imagine Betty's quiet conviction, tracing lines on her map, believing she had glimpsed a chart of the heavens. Imagine Barney's quiet fear, carrying the weight of eyes that had looked too deeply into him. Both looking at the same sky, both living in the same marriage, both carrying truth in different ways. That is what it means to live with mystery, not to agree but to endure together. And so their story comes to us not as resolution but as invitation to wonder, to question, to listen, to let silence linger without forcing it into answers, to gaze at the stars with curiosity and humility in equal measure. As you reflect on their journey, allow yourself to feel the rhythm of their road, the hum of tires, the breath of wind through pine, the quiet tick of a watch that no longer keeps time. Their story is not only theirs, it belongs also to the rhythm of night itself, the way time can stretch, bend, disappear. The way silence can feel heavy with presence. Their legacy is not certainty, it is something gentler, the reminder that life is richer when we allow space for the unknown, that not every question must be answered, that mystery itself can be companion, guiding us toward humility and awe.
As the narrative of Betty and Barney Hill draws to its close, we are left not with answers but with presence. Their story endures because it does not resolve. It leaves room for fear and wonder, for belief and doubt, for silence that is full rather than empty. In that way, it mirrors life itself. Betty's long years of testimony, her letters, her steady voice, remind us of the resilience of conviction. She carried her memory not as proof to persuade, but as truth to preserve. Her courage lay not in conquering mystery, but in living with it. She gave the world her map, her journals, her gentle insistence that what she remembered mattered. Barney's journey reminds us of another kind of courage, the courage to face fear. His trembling voice in Dr. Simon's office, his tears, his silences, these were not weaknesses. They were evidence of his honesty. He bore what had happened to him, even when it broke him open. That vulnerability is as much a legacy as Betty's certainty. Together they show us that to live with mystery is not to conquer it, but to endure it. To sit in the silence, even when it is heavy. To look at the sky, even when it looks back. To carry memory, even when it does not fit into the neat boxes of reason. As their story spread outward, it became part of something larger than themselves. It shaped folklore, psychology, science fiction, art. It gave birth to archetypes, to images that now feel timeless. Yet beneath all that cultural weight, there remain two people in a car, driving home from a vacation, gazing at the stars. That ordinariness is what makes their story so enduring. It tells us that mystery is not distant. It waits on familiar roads, in the rhythm of daily life, in the quiet moments when the ordinary bends into the extraordinary. And so, as we close their chapter, we are invited to carry forward what matters most, not proof, not argument, but humility. The hills remind us that the universe is vast, and our place within it small. They remind us that memory is fragile, but powerful. They remind us that belief is not always about evidence, but about courage. As you listen, let their story soften into the rhythm of your own breath. Let the silence between their words become the silence of the room around you. Let the stars above their road become the stars above your own rest. Imagine the road again. The car moves forward, steady, quiet. The night air is cool. Pines line the roadside, their branches swaying gently. Above, the stars shine, ancient, constant, infinite. Somewhere among them may be the map. Betty remembered the lines of travel traced between suns. Somewhere among them may be the gaze. Barney felt upon him, vast and unblinking. You do not need to know, you only need to feel the wonder of not knowing. The hill's story closes, but the silence remains. A silence not of absence, but of possibility. A silence that invites rest, reflection, dream. Night settles gently, as it always has. as it always will. The story of Betty and Barney Hill draws to its end, but the silence it leaves behind is not empty. It is a silence that comforts, a silence that invites you to drift into rest. The Hills began as two travelers on a lonely road, surrounded by pine and starlight. Their journey carried them into mystery, through missing time, through dreams, through voices trembling under hypnosis. Their courage carried them further still, into testimony that reshaped the way the world thinks of the unknown. Now their voices fade into memory, leaving us with reflection rather than conclusion. As you listen, let the rhythm of their journey become the rhythm of your breath. Inhale slowly, as though drawing in the cool night air through the car window. Exhale gently, as though releasing the weight of hours gone. With each breath, the body grows quieter, softer, more at ease. Their story reminds us that mystery is not an intrusion, but a companion. It has always been with us, in tales told around fires, in dreams shared at dawn, in the silence of stars. The Hills' night in September 1961 was one thread in this tapestry, a reminder that mystery still walks beside us on familiar roads. Let yourself rest in that thought, that you too are part of this great tapestry. Your memories, your dreams, your silences, they are as much a part of the human story as Betty's map or Barney's fear. You carry your own mysteries, and they are enough. You do not need to solve them tonight. You need only let them rest. Imagine yourself now on a quiet road. The tires hum softly. The headlights stretch ahead in a narrow tunnel of light. Pines line the roadside, their branches reaching upward. Above, the sky is endless, sprinkled with stars. Some are bright, some faint. Somewhere among them, perhaps, lies the origin Betty traced on her map. Somewhere among them, perhaps, lies a gaze too vast for comprehension. You do not need to know. You only need to feel the vastness and let it lull you into calm. The Hills remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of carrying it. Barney's trembling voice is part of their legacy, as vital as Betty's certainty. In his fear we see honesty. In her conviction we see persistence. Together they remind us that to live with mystery is to live with both fear and wonder, silence and speech. Let those words soften around you now. Fear and wonder, silence and speech, mystery and memory. They are not opposites, but companions, moving together like stars across the night. As your body sinks deeper into rest, let yourself drift between memory and dream. The boundary between them is soft, like mist. It was soft for Betty, who dreamed of examinations that felt more than dreams. It was soft for Barney, who awoke miles down the road with hours missing. It is soft for all of us. When we lie down to sleep, drift into that softness now. Let thoughts pass like headlights of distant cars, seen for a moment, then gone. Let silence deepen, until even the hum of the road fades. The Hills' legacy is not certainty, it is wonder. Wonder that the universe is larger than we can imagine. Wonder that memory, however fragile, can shape culture, myth, and belief. Wonder that two ordinary people on one ordinary night could become part of something infinite. Carry that wonder with you now, not as weight but as lightness. Let it ease the mind, soften the heart, calm the body. Mystery does not demand effort. It asks only that you rest with it, as you are. As you lie here, picture the stars once more. Imagine their stillness, their ancient glow. Imagine their silence, vast and endless. This silence is the same silence the Hills felt on the road. It is the same silence that fills your room now. It is not empty. It is full, full of possibility, full of comfort, full of dreams. And so the story closes, not with answers, but with peace. Betty's map is folded. Barney's voice is quiet. The car rests at the roadside. The night deepens. The sky remains. Breathe once more, slowly. Inhale the quiet. Exhale the day. Let the silence settle around you like a blanket. Let the stars above carry you into dreams. Sleep well.